The town of Bitter Creek didn't have a real name on any map. It was just a scatter of buildings squatting in the dust where the wagon train stopped long enough to bury their dead and move on. The wind never stopped blowing there, carrying grit that worked its way into everything: clothes, coffee, the creases around men's eyes. It was the kind of place where people came to forget or be forgotten, and nobody asked which. Ethan Hale had ridden in just after dawn, his pack horse loaded with winter pelts that would fetch enough to see him through another season alone. He was a big man, broader through the shoulders than most, with hands scarred from trap lines and a face that hadn't smiled in so long the muscles had forgotten how. His beard was darker than his hair, both touched with early gray, though he couldn't have been more than 35. People moved aside when he walked down the rutted excuse for a main street, not from fear exactly, but from the recognition that here was a man who lived beyond the edge of ordinary human commerce. He'd been coming to Bitter Creek for 6 years, always in early spring, always alone. The trading post owner, a wheezing man named Mackey with tobacco-stained teeth, knew better than to make small talk. They conducted their business in silence. Pelts weighed, money counted, supplies loaded. Ethan bought salt, flour, coffee, ammunition, and lamp oil. Never whiskey. Never anything that suggested comfort or pleasure. Survival goods only. He was loading the last sack onto his pack horse when he heard the commotion from the other end of the street. $20. Do I hear 20? Ethan's hand stilled on the rope. He knew that voice. Sykes, a man who dealt in whatever could be bought or sold and didn't care much about the difference between goods and people. Ethan had seen him sell indentured contracts before, a pretty word for an ugly thing. He'd always walked away from it, wanting no part of that particular sin. But today something made him turn. The auction block, really just a wagon bed with the sides removed, stood in front of the closed-up church. A small crowd had gathered, maybe 15 men, the kind who had money but no prospects of finding a woman any honest way. On the wagon stood a figure in a dress so faded it might have once been blue or gray or anything at all. She wasn't looking at the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on something distant, something none of them could see. She stood absolutely still, hands clasped in front of her, and even from 30 yards away, Ethan could see she'd gone somewhere else inside her head. He recognized that look. He'd seen it on animals in traps who'd stopped fighting. $20, Sykes called again. Come now, gentlemen, she's healthy, she can work, and she don't talk back because she don't talk much at all. Perfect for a man who wants help without hassle. She looks half dead already, someone shouted. She's just quiet. Comes from good stock. Husband died of cholera 6 months back, left her with debts she can't pay. You'd be doing Christian charity taking her on. Ethan's jaw tightened. Christian charity. As if buying a human being could ever be dressed up as kindness. He should walk away. He should mount up and ride back to his cabin in the high country and forget he'd ever seen this. He didn't need help. Didn't want it. The whole point of his life for the past 3 years had been to need nothing and no one. 15, someone called. 15, do I hear 20? Ethan's horse shifted beside him, sensing his tension. He'd seen auctions like this before. Seen what happened to women who ended up with the kind of men who bought them. He thought of Sarah, though he tried never to think of Sarah, and his hands formed fists. $20, he heard himself say. The words carried across the dusty space. Heads turned. Sykes shaded his eyes against the morning sun. That you, Hale? Come on up where I can see your money. Ethan tied his horses and walked toward the auction block. The crowd parted for him. Up close, he could see the woman more clearly. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty before grief had carved it down to essentials. Her dress hung loose on a frame that had lost weight recently. Her hands, he noticed, were work-hardened but trembling slightly. She still hadn't looked at him, hadn't looked at anyone. You sure about this, Hale? Sykes asked, suddenly uncertain. You live pretty remote, ain't no neighbors for miles. Some might say that ain't proper. You asking about propriety while selling a woman like livestock? Ethan's voice was quiet, but it cut. Sykes flushed. It's legal contract labor. All documented. Then document it and take my money. $20 in coins counted into Sykes's palm. Papers signed. Her mark, not her signature, Ethan noticed, because her hands were shaking too badly to write. The whole transaction took less than 5 minutes. That's all the time it took to buy a human life in Bitter Creek. Her name's Clara Vance, Sykes said, handing over the papers. She don't eat much, and she's been working at the boarding house since her husband passed, so she knows her way around cooking and cleaning. You got yourself a good bargain. Ethan didn't answer. He looked at the woman, Clara, for the first time directly. She'd finally moved her gaze, not to him, but to her own hands, studying them as if they belonged to someone else. Can you ride? He asked. She nodded once. Get on the pack horse. We're leaving. He helped her up. She weighed almost nothing, and mounted his own horse without looking back at the crowd or Sykes or the town. Within 10 minutes, Bitter Creek was behind them, dissolving into the dust. They rode in silence. The trail climbed steadily, leaving the flatlands for foothills. Then the foothills for mountains still crowned with snow, despite the spring thaw in the valleys. Ethan set a pace that was ground-covering but not punishing, stopping once at midday to water the horses and hand Clara a piece of dried meat and hardtack. She ate mechanically, without apparent taste or interest. When he asked if she needed to rest longer, she shook her head. By late afternoon, they'd entered country that looked like it had never heard of civilization. Pine forest thick enough to block the sky, broken only by meadows where last year's grass lay matted under new growth. A creek ran parallel to the trail, swollen with snowmelt, its voice the only sound besides hoofbeats and wind. Ethan found himself watching her from the corner of his eye. She sat the horse competently enough, moving with it rather than against it, but there was no awareness in her posture, no curiosity about where they were going. She might as well have been cargo. What the hell had he done? He didn't need help, didn't want company. For 3 years he'd lived alone in these mountains, running trap lines in winter, hunting in summer, speaking to no one for months at a time. It was exactly the life he'd wanted after. He cut that thought off hard. The past was past. Sarah was past. Everything that had happened was done and couldn't be changed. So why had he bought this woman? The answer came reluctantly, because he couldn't walk away. Because somewhere under the numbness, he still had enough humanity left to not let her be sold to the kind of man who'd bid on a woman like buying a mule. That was all. Simple charity, if there was anything simple about it. She could cook and clean, maybe tend a garden. She'd earn her keep through the summer, and come fall he'd take her back to town with enough money to start over somewhere else. 6 months. He could endure another human being for 6 months. It was nearly dark when they reached the cabin. It sat in a clearing carved from the forest, backed against a cliff that sheltered it from the north wind. Solid log construction, chinked against winter, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A shed and small barn stood nearby. A garden plot, still unplanted, marked out with stakes and string. Everything was neat, functional, built to last. Everything was also completely silent. Ethan dismounted and reached up to help Clara down. She slid from the horse and stood looking at the cabin with the same blank expression she'd worn all day. "You'll sleep in the loft," he said. "There's a stove, firewood inside, and more stacked outside. Root cellars around back. I'll show you everything tomorrow. For now, just—" He was interrupted by a sound from inside the cabin. It was faint, weak, but unmistakable. A baby crying. Clara's head came up fast, the first real reaction he'd seen from her. Her eyes went wide, locked on the cabin door. "That's my son," Ethan said, and heard his own voice roughen. He stopped, started again. "You'll need to know. My wife died 3 months ago, childbirth fever. The baby won't nurse. I've had 4 women try, brought them up from the valley. He won't take to any of them. There's a woman there now, 5th one. She's leaving in the morning." The crying continued, thin and desperate. Clara was staring at him now, really seeing him for the first time. Her lips parted, but no words came out. "I didn't bring you here for that," Ethan said quickly. "I know how it looks, but that's not why. I needed help with the place. The baby, He couldn't finish. Couldn't say what he knew to be true. That his son was dying by inches, day by day, refusing life, and there was nothing Ethan could do to stop it. He turned away and pushed open the cabin door. Inside, lamplight revealed a single large room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A table and chairs sat near the kitchen area. A rope bed was built into the far corner, currently occupied by a middle-aged woman with a face like she'd been chewing nails. She was trying to get the baby to take a bottle, but the infant, impossibly small, wrapped in blankets, was twisting his head away. that thin wail continuing without pause. "He won't eat, Hale," the woman said flatly. "I told you yesterday he wouldn't. I told you a week ago. This baby don't want to live, and there ain't nothing I can do about it." "Keep trying," Ethan said, but it came out hollow. "I'm leaving at first light like we agreed. I can't watch this. I got children of my own, and I won't." She stood up, thrust the baby at Ethan. "Here, maybe he'll take to his father." But when Ethan took his son who weighed nothing, who felt like holding a bird, the crying only intensified. The baby's face was red, his tiny fists clenched, his whole body rigid with refusal. "Thomas," Ethan said softly, "please, please try." The baby screamed. Clara stood in the doorway, still as stone, her eyes fixed on the child in Ethan's arms. In the lamplight, he could see her face had gone white, could see something moving behind her eyes, recognition, pain, something too complex to name. "I'll be in the barn," the wet nurse said, gathering her things. "You can settle up with me in the morning." She pushed past Clara without a glance and was gone. The door closed. The crying continued. Ethan stood there holding his dying son and felt the same helplessness that had plagued him for 3 months wash over him again. He'd survived things that would have broken most men. He'd fought off mountain lions and survived blizzards and gone weeks without food. But this, a baby who wouldn't eat, this was defeating him. "I'll show you the loft," he said to Clara, having to raise his voice over the crying. "You must be tired." But Clara wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the baby with an expression that made something twist in Ethan's chest. It wasn't pity, exactly. It was more like recognition. Like she saw something in that tiny, struggling life that no one else could see. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "Clara, the loft." She nodded slowly, breaking her gaze away from Thomas, and climbed the ladder to the upper level without a word. Ethan spent the next 2 hours trying everything he'd tried 100 times before. Warm milk from the goat, sweetened water, bread soaked soft. Thomas refused it all, crying until he exhausted himself into silence, lying in Ethan's arms with his eyes closed and his breathing too fast, too shallow. He was dying. Ethan had known it for weeks but kept refusing to accept it. But tonight, holding his son while the lamplight burned low and the fire crumbled to embers, he finally let himself believe it. By summer, maybe sooner, Thomas would be gone. 3 months old, and he'd never known anything but hunger and crying and a father who couldn't save him. Sarah would have known what to do. But Sarah was in the ground on the hillside behind the cabin, buried under stones Ethan had carried one by one, and she wasn't coming back no matter how much he wished otherwise. Around midnight, Thomas fell into a fitful sleep. Ethan laid him in the wooden cradle he had built before the birth, back when he'd still believed in futures and plans, and sat at the table with his head in his hands. From the loft came no sound at all. Clara might as well have been a ghost. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat listening to his son's ragged breathing, counting the spaces between each breath, wondering if the next one would come. Outside, an owl called. The fire went out. Darkness pooled in the corners of the cabin. And in the loft, lying on a straw tick mattress under borrowed blankets, Clara Vance pressed both hands against her belly and felt the ghost of what she'd lost 6 months ago when the cholera took not just her husband, but the child she'd been carrying, 8 months along. A daughter, she'd been certain, though she'd never know for sure. The ache in her breasts hadn't entirely faded even now. Her body still remembered what it had been preparing to do. And tonight, hearing that baby cry, that ache had become a physical pain so sharp she'd bitten her lip to keep from making a sound. She knew that cry. Knew it bone deep. It was the cry of a baby who was starving, whose instincts were screaming for milk, for warmth, for the one thing that would save him, and he wasn't getting it. She'd heard Ethan say the baby wouldn't nurse from anyone, wouldn't take a bottle, but Clara had worked at the boarding house long enough to know that sometimes it wasn't about the milk. Sometimes it was about the person holding the child. Sometimes babies knew things adults had forgotten. She lay in the darkness and listened to that man downstairs trying to save his son with goat's milk and sweetened water and everything except the one thing the baby actually needed. It wasn't her business. She was here to work, to keep her head down and earn enough to pay off her debts, and maybe, eventually, figure out how to keep living in a world that had taken everything from her. Getting involved with a dying baby and a grieving father was the last thing she should do. But she couldn't stop hearing that cry, couldn't stop feeling the phantom weight of the daughter she'd never held. And as dawn began to gray the windows, Clara made a decision that would change everything. The wet nurse left at first light, taking her payment and leaving behind a list of instructions Ethan already knew by heart. He stood on the porch and watched her ride down the trail until the forest swallowed her up, then turned back to the cabin where Thomas was crying again, that weak, defeated sound that was somehow worse than the desperate screaming. Clara was already up, had the fire going and coffee on. She'd found the bread and laid out breakfast without being asked. She moved quietly, efficiently, like someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. "Thank you," Ethan said, pouring coffee with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. She nodded, but didn't speak, didn't look at him. Just kept working, slicing bread, setting out butter and jam that were probably older than they should be. From the cradle, Thomas's crying intensified. Ethan closed his eyes. He couldn't do this again. Couldn't face another day of trying and failing, of watching his son slip further away. He'd gotten maybe an hour of sleep total, and that was more than Thomas had managed. The baby would cry until he exhausted himself, sleep for 20 minutes, wake, and cry again. It had been the pattern for 3 months, and Ethan was starting to understand how men went mad from things that seemed small until they weren't. "I need to check the trap lines," he said abruptly. "I've been neglecting them. I'll be gone most of the day." It was a coward's escape, and he knew it, but he couldn't stay here and listen to his son die. Not today. "There's food in the root cellar. The well's behind the cabin. If you need anything—" He stopped. If she needed anything, she was out of luck. The nearest neighbor was 20 miles away. Clara was looking at him now, really looking, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't read. "Go," she said, the first word she'd spoken since yesterday's yes about being able to ride. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, roughened by disuse or grief or both. Ethan grabbed his rifle and left before he could change his mind, before the sound of Thomas crying could root him to the floor again. He'd check the high meadow traps, maybe hunt for fresh meat, anything to be away from the cabin and the cradle and the slow-motion catastrophe he couldn't prevent. The door closed behind him, his boots on the porch steps. Then silence, except for Thomas's crying. Clara stood perfectly still in the middle of the cabin, listening to the sound of Ethan's horse leaving. Then she turned and looked at the cradle. The baby was so small, frighteningly small. His face was red from crying, his tiny fists waving weakly. She could see the shape of his skull through his skin, could see the way his ribs stood out even through the blanket. He was starving, literally starving to death while surrounded by people trying to save him. She crossed the room slowly, as if approaching something wild that might bolt. Stood looking down at him. Thomas's eyes were open, dark blue and unfocused. He was crying, but it was mechanical now, reflexive, like he'd forgotten why he'd started. His lips were chapped. When Clara touched one tiny hand, his fingers were cold. Something broke open in her chest. She'd been hollow for 6 months, empty, going through motions of living without actually being alive. When Sykes had sold her yesterday, sold her like furniture, like nothing, she hadn't cared because there was nothing left inside her to care with. She'd gone to the auction block the same way she'd done everything since the cholera took her husband and baby, numb, distant, waiting without hope for whatever came next. But looking at this baby, hearing his cry, feeling his cold little fingers, she was still hollow. But hollow things could be filled. Clara picked Thomas up. He weighed almost nothing, lighter than a sack of flour, lighter than seemed possible for something alive. She held him against her chest, swaying slightly, making soft sounds that came from somewhere so deep she didn't recognize them as her own voice. "Shh," she whispered. "Shh, little one. I know what you need." Thomas kept crying, but it changed pitch slightly, became questioning instead of demanding. Clara sat down in the rocking chair by the window. Her heart was pounding, her hands were shaking. What she was thinking, what she was considering, it was impossible. Insane. She hadn't been pregnant in 6 months. She hadn't carried a baby to term. There was no reason to think her body could do what she was thinking about, except she could feel the ache in her breasts, sharper now than it had been in months. could feel her body responding to that crying the way it hadn't responded to anything since the cholera. Could feel something that might have been instinct or might have been desperation telling her that this baby knew what he needed and everyone had been too stupid to listen. With trembling fingers, Clara unfastened her dress. She'd nursed babies before. Her sister's children when they were young, before she'd married and moved to Bitter Creek. She knew how it worked, knew how to hold an infant, how to help them latch. But those had been healthy babies with mothers who had milk. This was something else entirely. Thomas was still crying when she brought him to her breast. For a long moment, nothing happened. He turned his head away, that same rejection he'd shown everyone else, and Clara felt her hope crumble. But then, Thomas turned back. His crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a questioning silence. His mouth opened, searching, and then he latched. Clara gasped. Pain lanced through her, sharp and shocking and somehow right. Thomas made a small sound, halfway between surprise and triumph. And then he was nursing, actually nursing, his tiny jaw working with sudden, fierce determination. She felt it then. The letdown, unmistakable, impossible. Felt her body responding to this baby's need the way it hadn't been able to respond to her own daughter's death. Felt milk flowing, felt Thomas drinking it down with desperate hunger, felt 6 months of numbness crack open into something that was either terrible pain or tremendous relief. Tears ran down her face. She couldn't stop them, didn't try. Thomas nursed like he was starving, which he was, making small urgent sounds, his cold little hands suddenly warm against her skin. 5 minutes passed. 10. He didn't stop, didn't pull away, just kept nursing with single-minded focus. Clara held him and cried and understood that whatever had just happened, there was no going back from it. She'd crossed a line. Broken some rule she didn't fully understand. When Ethan returned and found out what she'd done, but Thomas was alive, was drinking, was getting what he needed for the first time in his short, struggling life. That had to be worth whatever came next. She nursed him for 20 minutes before he finally slowed, his jaw movements becoming lazy, his eyes drifting closed. When she tried to shift him to her other breast, he didn't latch, just made a small, satisfied sound and fell asleep against her, his face peaceful for the first time since she'd entered this cabin. Clara held him for a long time, watching him sleep, feeling his warmth, listening to his breathing slow and deepen into something that sounded, finally, like health. When she was certain he was truly asleep, she laid him carefully in the cradle. He didn't wake, didn't cry, just slept. One tiny fist curled under his chin, his face already looking less skeletal than it had an hour ago. Clara refastened her dress with shaking hands. Her breast ached, but it was a good ache, purposeful. Her whole body felt different, like it had remembered something it was meant to do. She stood looking down at Thomas and thought, I saved you. And then, what have I done? Ethan didn't return until late afternoon. He'd checked every trap in the high meadow, taken down 2 rabbits, and spent far too long sitting by a creek trying to work up the will to go home. He was a coward. He knew it. But the thought of walking back into that cabin and hearing Thomas cry, except when he came within sight of the clearing, he didn't hear crying. He heard nothing at all. Ethan's heart stopped. He urged his horse faster, already imagining the worst, already seeing in his mind's eye what he'd find. Thomas still and silent in his cradle, Clara standing helplessly by, death finally winning the battle it had been waging for 3 months. He hit the ground before his horse fully stopped and took the porch steps in one stride. The cabin door swung open, and there was Clara, standing by the stove with a wooden spoon in one hand, looking up at him with an expression that was equal parts defiant and terrified. And there was Thomas, asleep in his cradle, but not the fitful half-death sleep Ethan had grown used to. Real sleep, deep sleep. His face was peaceful, and Ethan's breath caught. Thomas had color, actual color. His cheeks were faintly pink instead of gray. His breathing was slow and even. He looked, for the first time since Sarah had died, like a baby instead of a dying thing. What? Ethan's voice came out hoarse. What happened? Clara set down the wooden spoon very carefully, drew herself up straight. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched white-knuckled at her sides. I fed him. What? I nursed him. This morning, after you left. He latched and he drank, and he's been sleeping ever since." The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. Ethan stared at her, then at Thomas, then back at her. But that's not, you didn't, I know what I am and what I'm not," Clara said, and there was steel in her voice now, the first real strength he'd heard from her. "I know it shouldn't have worked. I know I have no right and no reason. But your son was dying and I could hear it and I couldn't listen to it anymore. So I tried, and it worked." Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides, looked down at Thomas. The baby was definitely breathing better, definitely looked healthier. His little chest rose and fell evenly. His hands were relaxed instead of clenched. "How?" Ethan demanded. "You said your husband died 6 months ago. You couldn't have—" "I was pregnant," Clara said quietly. 8 months. Lost the baby when the cholera came. My body didn't know the difference. It's still—" She stopped, started again. "Sometimes a mother's milk comes in even after. Sometimes it stays. Mine did. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try." Ethan felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. This woman, this stranger he'd bought yesterday, had been carrying a dead child's milk for 6 months and had just given it to his son. It was grotesque. It was unnatural. It was— Thomas made a small sound in his sleep, peaceful and content. "It was a miracle." "Why didn't you ask?" Ethan heard himself say. "Why didn't you tell me before? Would you have let me?" Clara's eyes met his directly for the first time, and they were hard. "Would you have believed me? Would you have let a woman you bought at auction put her hands on your son?" No. The answer was no, and they both knew it. Ethan looked at Thomas again, looked at Clara. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with what had happened, trying to understand the implications. This woman had saved his son's life. This woman had done something impossible. This woman was now bound to them in a way that went far beyond any contract or arrangement. "He'll need to nurse again," Clara said. "Probably soon. Babies this young eat every few hours. If you want me to leave, say so now. But if I leave, he'll start dying again. We both know it." It wasn't a threat. It was just truth, stark and unavoidable. Ethan should have been angry, should have felt violated or betrayed or something. But all he felt was a vast, overwhelming relief that threatened to bring him to his knees. "Don't leave," he said. His voice cracked. "Please, don't. He needs you. I can't." He couldn't finish, couldn't find words for the admission that he'd been helpless, and she'd done what he couldn't. Clara nodded once, sharp. "Then we understand each other. I'll take care of him, that's all. Just the baby, nothing else." "Of course," Ethan said quickly. I didn't bring you here for anything except work. This doesn't change—" But it did change everything, and they both knew it. Thomas stirred, made a questioning sound. Clara moved to the cradle immediately, picked him up with a competence that suggested she'd done this many times today. Thomas fussed briefly, then settled against her, his tiny mouth searching. "I'll be outside," Ethan said, and fled to the porch like the coward he was. He stood there in the late afternoon sun, gripping the porch railing hard enough to make the wood creak, and tried to understand what had just happened to his life. This morning he'd had a dying son and a stranger he'd bought out of guilt. Tonight he had a son who might live, and a woman who was now essential to that survival. The balance of power had shifted so completely he was still reeling from it. Inside he heard Clara's voice, soft and low, talking to Thomas. Heard the baby make contented sounds. Heard, for the first time in 3 months, something that wasn't crying or silence. Heard life. Ethan closed his eyes and let himself feel it. The relief, the gratitude, the fear of what it meant to need someone again after he'd sworn he never would. Sarah was gone. His old life was gone. But maybe, just maybe, there was something else being built here in the ruins. He didn't know what it was yet. Didn't know if he could trust it, or her, or anything beyond the immediate fact that his son was alive. But for now, that was enough. Inside, Thomas finished nursing and fell back asleep. Clara held him for a long time, memorizing the weight of him, the warmth. A baby who wasn't hers, but who needed her anyway. A child she was keeping alive with her body. It should have felt wrong. It should have felt like a betrayal of the daughter she'd lost. Instead, it felt like the first right thing she'd done in 6 months. She looked toward the door where Ethan had disappeared and wondered what came next. Wondered if he'd wake up tomorrow and change his mind. Wondered if she'd overstepped so badly that he'd send her away despite everything. Wondered if she could survive losing another child, even one that wasn't hers. But those were tomorrow's questions. Tonight she held a sleeping baby and felt her body doing what it was meant to do. Tonight, in a cabin in the mountains where no one would ever think to look for her, Clara Vance had found a purpose again. Even if it destroyed her, it would be worth it. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire. Inside, three people who'd been alone found themselves tied together by the most fundamental of bonds: life, death, and the stubborn refusal to let go. The night came on gentle. For the first time in 3 months, Thomas slept through it. And somewhere in the darkness, both Ethan and Clara lay awake in their separate spaces, listening to that peaceful breathing and wondering what the morning would bring. The silence woke him. Ethan opened his eyes in the pre-dawn darkness and lay perfectly still, listening. No crying, no desperate thin wail that had become the soundtrack to his existence. Just the ordinary sounds of the cabin settling, wind in the pines outside, and beneath it all, breathing. Steady, peaceful breathing from the cradle. He sat up slowly, afraid that movement might shatter whatever fragile peace had descended on his home. Gray light filtered through the windows. From the loft came no sound at all. Clara must still be sleeping. Ethan crossed to the cradle in his bare feet, the floorboards cold against his skin. Thomas lay on his back, one small fist near his mouth, eyes closed. His face had lost that gray, sunken look. His breathing was deep and even. As Ethan watched, the baby's lips pursed in his sleep, making a sucking motion, and something twisted hard in Ethan's chest. His son was alive, really alive, not just stubbornly clinging to existence because of her. Ethan turned and looked up at the loft. He could see the edge of the straw mattress, one corner of the blanket he'd given Clara. Nothing else. She was as silent as she'd been since he'd brought her here, as if she'd learned long ago that being quiet meant being safe. What did he know about her really? That her husband had died. That she'd been pregnant and lost the baby. That she'd been desperate enough, or broken enough, to let herself be sold like property. And now she was upstairs in his cabin, bound to him by the simple fact that his son needed her to survive. He should feel grateful. He did feel grateful, but underneath the gratitude was something more complicated. Resentment, maybe, that he needed anyone at all. Or fear of what it meant to depend on someone again after Sarah. Thomas stirred, made a small questioning sound. His eyes fluttered open, that unfocused baby stare that seemed to look through everything. Then his face began to scrunch up, the prelude to crying that Ethan knew too well. "Shh," Ethan whispered, reaching down to pick him up. "Don't wake her yet." But Thomas's face was already going red, his mouth opening. "He's hungry." Ethan spun around. Clara was climbing down the loft ladder, fully dressed despite the early hour. Her hair was braided back severely, her dress buttoned to the throat. She looked at Thomas, not at Ethan. "I'll take him," she said. It wasn't a question. The baby latched immediately, that same desperate hunger from yesterday, and Clara's face went very still. "Does it hurt?" Ethan asked, and immediately regretted it. Too personal, too intimate. But Clara answered without looking up. "Yes, at first. Then it's just what it is." Thomas nursed with single-minded focus, his tiny hands kneading against Clara's skin. The only sounds were the creak of the rocking chair and the soft, wet noises of feeding. Dawn light grew stronger, painting everything in shades of gold. Ethan made himself turn away, busied himself building up the fire, putting coffee on. Normal morning tasks, except nothing about this morning was normal. Yesterday his son had been dying, and Clara had been a stranger he'd bought out of guilt. Today she was nursing Thomas in his rocking chair, and he was making her coffee, and they were what? What were they now? "I'll need to eat more," Clara said quietly. "If I'm going to keep feeding him, my body needs fuel to make milk." "Whatever you need. There's venison in the cold box, eggs from the hens, flour, and cornmeal. I can bring up supplies from town if—" "I won't go to town," Clara said sharply, the first real emotion he'd heard in her voice. "I can't. If people knew what I was doing, they'd think—" She stopped. "I won't go back to Bitter Creek. Not ever." Ethan understood. What she was doing, nursing a baby that wasn't hers, living alone with a man she wasn't married to. It would be scandal enough to ruin what little reputation she had left. The town would call her wet nurse at best, whore at worst, and never mind that she was saving a child's life. "You don't have to go anywhere," he said. "I'll handle supplies. You just focus on Thomas." She nodded once, still not looking at him. Thomas had slowed his nursing, was starting to drift back to sleep. Clara shifted him to her other breast, and he latched again, but lazily this time, more comfort than hunger. "How long will it take?" Ethan asked. Before he's strong enough that he doesn't need to nurse so often." "Months," Clara said. 3, 4, maybe more. Babies need milk for a long time, and he's been starving, so his body will need extra to recover." She paused. "If you want me to stay that long, I want you to stay." The words came out faster than he'd intended, more desperate. Clara's eyes flicked up to his face, then away. "As long as Thomas needs me," she said. "After that, we'll see." It was the most she'd offered. Ethan took it. Thomas fell asleep at the breast. Clara held him for a few more minutes, then rose and laid him carefully in the cradle. When she turned back, she was fastening her dress, her movements brisk and businesslike. "I'll make breakfast," she said. "Then I should start on the cleaning. This place needs—" She stopped, seeming to realize she was about to criticize his housekeeping. "It needs a woman's touch," Ethan finished. "I know, I've been focused on other things. Like keeping your son alive. Like failing to keep my son alive." The words hung between them, raw and true. Clara looked at him directly for the first time since she'd come downstairs, and in her eyes he saw recognition. She knew what failure felt like, knew what it was to watch helplessly while life slipped away. "You didn't fail," she said quietly. "You just needed help. There's no shame in that." But there was shame in it, at least for Ethan. He'd spent 3 years learning to need nothing and no one, had built a life in these mountains specifically to avoid depending on other people, and now here was this woman telling him that needing help was acceptable, and he wanted to believe her but couldn't quite manage it. "I'll check the animals," he said instead, and escaped to the barn before she could say anything else that might crack the walls he'd built. The morning passed in a strange new rhythm. Ethan did his usual chores, feeding the horse and mules, checking the chickens, splitting firewood, while from inside the cabin came sounds he'd almost forgotten. The swish of a broom, the clatter of dishes being washed, the creak of the rocking chair when Thomas needed feeding again. He came in for the midday meal to find the cabin transformed. Floor swept, cobwebs gone, dishes clean and stacked. The blankets on his bed had been changed. Even the windows had been washed, letting in clear light that made the whole space feel different. Clara had made stew from the venison and vegetables from the root cellar. She served it silently, setting a bowl in front of him before taking her own to the far side of the table. They ate without speaking, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Just two people too tired or too damaged to make small talk. "This is good," Ethan said finally. "The stew. It's good." "Thank you." "My wife, Sarah, she was a good cook too, better than me. I've been eating poorly since—" He trailed off, not sure why he'd brought up Sarah at all. Clara set down her spoon very carefully. "How long were you married?" 6 years. Met her in Denver, brought her out here when we built the cabin. She loved it at first. The mountains, the quiet. Then it got lonely. By the end, He stopped. He'd never said this out loud to anyone. By the end, she hated it here. Hated me for bringing her. The pregnancy was hard, and she kept saying if we'd been in town, near a doctor, it would have been easier. She wasn't wrong. She died in childbirth? 3 days after, fever set in. I tried everything. Cool water, willow bark tea, prayers to a deity I'd stopped believing in years before. Nothing worked. She was gone in less than a week, and Thomas wouldn't nurse from her even before she got sick. It was like he knew something was wrong. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My husband's name was Daniel. We'd been married 2 years when the cholera came through. He was gone in 3 days. I got sick too, but I lived. The baby didn't. I don't know if it was the fever or the shock or just bad luck, but one morning I woke up and couldn't feel her moving anymore. The midwife said it happens sometimes, that sometimes the mother's body decides to save itself instead of the child. Her voice was flat, emotionless, but her hands were clenched white-knuckled around her spoon. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and meant it. "Me too, for your wife, for your son almost joining her." They finished the meal in silence, but it was a different silence now. The silence of two people who'd both lost everything and were still trying to figure out how to keep living anyway. That afternoon, while Thomas slept, Clara worked in the garden plot. Ethan had meant to plant it weeks ago, but had never found the energy. She worked methodically, turning the soil with a spade he'd left leaning against the shed, her movements economical and practiced. He should help, should at least offer, but instead he found himself watching from the porch, trying to reconcile this woman with the broken, silent figure he'd bought 2 days ago. She was still quiet, still kept her eyes down most of the time. But when she held Thomas or worked in the garden, something shifted in her posture. Purpose, maybe. Or just the relief of having something to do besides endure. Thomas woke crying just before sunset. Clara was in the garden, hands covered in dirt, and for a moment Ethan thought about trying to soothe the baby himself. But Thomas's cry had that particular pitch that meant hunger, and Ethan knew from hard experience that nothing but milk would satisfy it. "Clara!" he called from the doorway. "He's awake!" She came immediately, wiping her hands on her skirt, and took Thomas from the cradle without a word. Settled into the rocking chair. Unfastened her dress. Thomas latched, and the crying stopped, replaced by that wet, satisfied sound of feeding. Ethan busied himself starting dinner, trying not to watch, trying not to think about how domestic this all felt. Like they were a family instead of a man and a woman thrown together by desperation and circumstance. "How long have you been alone up here?" Clara asked suddenly. 3 years, more or less. I came to the mountains after—" He paused. After what? After Denver, after the war, after everything that had happened before he'd met Sarah. After I decided I was done with people. "That working out for you?" There was something almost like humor in her voice. Ethan turned to look at her. She was watching him with an expression that might have been a smile if her face remembered how. "Not particularly," he admitted. "Turns out you can't run from everything. Some things follow you. Like grief." "Like grief?" Thomas finished nursing and immediately threw up, a small stream of milk that soaked Clara's shoulder. She didn't flinch, just grabbed a cloth and wiped both herself and the baby with a practiced efficiency that spoke of experience. "He's eating too fast," she said. "His stomach isn't used to being full. I need to nurse him more often, but for shorter times. Let his body adjust." "How do you know all this?" "I helped raise my sister's children before I married. 4 of them, all nursed. You learn things." She lifted Thomas to her shoulder, patting his back gently until he burped. "Babies are simpler than people think. They cry when they need something, stop crying when they get it. The trick is figuring out what they need." "I couldn't figure it out. For 3 months I tried everything and couldn't—" Ethan's voice roughened. "I was useless to him." Clara looked up at him, and her eyes were sharp. "You kept him alive. You got him this far. That's not useless. I bought wet nurses who couldn't help. I tried goat's milk and sugar water and every remedy anyone suggested. Nothing worked. Because he didn't need remedies. He needed his mother, but she was gone, so he needed the next best thing." Clara's hand moved in slow circles on Thomas's back. "Sometimes the thing that saves us isn't what we're looking for. Sometimes it just shows up, and we have to decide whether to accept it." She meant herself, Ethan realized. She was saying that she'd shown up, and he'd had to decide whether to accept her help. But the words worked both ways. She'd shown up broken and for sale, and she'd had to decide whether to accept this strange new life in the mountains. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I know it wasn't your choice, not really. I know the circumstances were—" He struggled for a word that didn't make him sound like the man who'd bought her. "Difficult. But I'm glad you're here. Thomas needs you. I need you." Clara's hand stilled on Thomas's back. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "Don't say that." "Say what?" "That you need me. I'm here for Thomas. Just Thomas. Anything else is—" She stopped. "I can't be needed that way again. Can't be responsible for another person's life beyond keeping this baby fed. Don't put that on me." The vehemence in her voice startled him. Ethan held up his hands. "I didn't mean—" I'm not asking for anything except what you're already doing, taking care of Thomas. That's all. She nodded tightly, but she didn't look convinced, just turned her attention back to the baby, shutting him out as completely as if she'd closed a door. Dinner was quiet. Afterward, Clara washed dishes while Ethan sat with Thomas, holding his son and marveling at how much stronger he already seemed. 2 days. In 2 days, Clara had accomplished what months of desperate attempts had failed to achieve. Magic, some would call it. Witchcraft, others might say. Ethan didn't care what it was called. His son was alive, and that was all that mattered. That night, after Clara had climbed to the loft and Thomas had fallen into his deep, milk-drunk sleep, Ethan sat by the fire and tried to think about the future. A week ago, he'd been planning Thomas's burial in his head, choosing a spot on the hillside near Sarah. Now he was thinking about summer, about Thomas getting bigger, about needing to add a proper room to the cabin instead of having Clara sleep in the loft, about what it would mean to have her here for months, maybe longer. He didn't let himself think about what would happen when Thomas didn't need her anymore, when he was old enough for solid food and Clara could leave without condemning him to death. That was a problem for another season. For now, he had a living son and a woman who'd saved him, and that was complicated enough. Upstairs, Clara lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling. Thomas's breathing, Ethan moving around below, the pop and crackle of the fire. She'd done something impossible today, had fed a starving baby with milk that shouldn't exist, and watched him grow stronger by the hour. It should have felt like triumph, should have felt like redemption for the baby she'd lost. Instead, it felt like picking up a burden she'd never be able to put down, because now Thomas needed her, would need her for months. And Ethan, despite what he'd said, was starting to need her too. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the relief in his eyes when she took Thomas from his arms. He was beginning to depend on her, and dependency was dangerous because it cut both ways. She'd depended on Daniel, and he'd died. Had depended on the baby in her womb, and she'd died too. Dependency meant pain, meant loss, meant waking up one morning to find that everything you'd built your life around had been torn away. Clara pressed her hands against her belly, feeling the flatness where her daughter had once been. She couldn't do this again, couldn't let herself care too much, need too much, want too much. She was here to keep Thomas alive, nothing more. When he was weaned, she'd leave, go somewhere else, start over again, build a life that didn't require her to love anyone or be loved in return. It was the only way to survive. The days developed a rhythm. Ethan would wake at dawn, build up the fire, make coffee. Clara would come down from the loft and take Thomas for his first feeding of the day. Breakfast would be quiet, functional. Then Ethan would head out to work the trap lines or hunt or repair fences, and Clara would spend the day caring for Thomas and managing the cabin. She was a relentless worker. Within a week, every surface had been scrubbed, every dish washed, every piece of laundry beaten clean against the rocks of the stream. She planted the garden with seeds Ethan had bought the previous fall and never used. She reorganized the root cellar, the pantry, even the barn. She sewed new curtains from fabric she found in a trunk, fabric that had probably been Sarah's, though Ethan didn't say anything about it. And she nursed Thomas. Every 2 hours during the day, every 3 at night, Ethan would wake to the sound of her climbing down the ladder, the creak of the rocking chair, the soft murmurs she made to soothe the baby back to sleep. He started sleeping lighter, listening for her, ready to help if she needed it, though she never asked. Thomas grew, not dramatically, not like plants sprouting from soil, but steadily, unmistakably. His face filled out. His arms and legs grew plumper. He started holding his head up for longer periods, started tracking movement with his eyes. He made sounds that weren't crying, little coos and gurgles that seemed to delight him. And he smiled. 3 weeks after Clara arrived, Thomas smiled for the first time. A real smile, not gas or random muscle movement. He smiled at Clara while she was nursing him, a sudden brightening of his whole face, and she made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. Ethan saw it from across the room and felt something break open in his chest. But with the progress came new tensions. Clara refused to let Ethan help with Thomas beyond holding him occasionally. She changed every diaper, soothed every cry, handled every feeding. When Ethan tried to give her a break, she'd shake her head and take the baby back, as if she didn't trust anyone else to keep him alive. You're exhausting yourself, Ethan said one evening, watching her pace with a fussy Thomas who wouldn't settle. Let me take him for a while. You need to sleep. He needs me. He needs his mother to not collapse from exhaustion. I'm not his mother. The words came out sharp, brittle. Clara stopped pacing, clutching Thomas against her chest. Her face had gone pale. I'm his wet nurse, she continued, her voice tight. That's all. His mother's dead and I'm just filling in until he's old enough that he doesn't need filling in anymore. Ethan stood slowly. Clara, don't tell me it's more than that. Don't tell me I'm becoming his mother, or that this is my baby, or any of those things people say to make themselves feel better about uncomfortable situations. I know what I am. I'm the woman you bought to work in your cabin who happens to be able to keep your son from starving. That's the beginning and end of it. Thomas had stopped fussing, seemed to sense the tension in the air. He looked up at Clara with his wide blue eyes, one small hand tangled in her hair. You're right, Ethan said quietly. I'm sorry, I overstepped. But they both knew he wasn't wrong. Clara was becoming Thomas's mother in every way that mattered, in the ways she held him, fed him, soothed him, watched over him. The only person who didn't see it was Clara herself. Or maybe she saw it too clearly, and that's what scared her. The first real fight came a month after Clara arrived. Ethan rode down to Bitter Creek for supplies. He'd been putting it off, making do with what they had, but they were low on flour and coffee, and he needed ammunition. He told Clara he'd be back by sunset, loaded his saddlebags, and left before the sun was fully up. The trip should have been routine. 5 hours down, 2 hours in town, 5 hours back. He'd be home by dark with plenty of time to spare. But when he got to Bitter Creek, he found Sykes waiting for him. Hail, the man said, stepping out from the trading post with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Heard you might be coming in. Wanted to talk to you about your purchase. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle. What about it? People are talking, saying you've had a woman up at your place for a month now, saying she's caring for your baby. Some folks think that's improper. Some folks think maybe the contract should be voided, the woman returned. Some folks should mind their own business. There's also the matter of her debts. I handled those when I sold her to you, but there's questions about whether they were fully settled. Her husband's creditors might have claims. They might want her back to work them off. Ethan stepped closer. Sykes backed up, but kept talking. I'm just saying, legally speaking, the situation is complicated. If you wanted to avoid complications, you could return her. I'd even refund half your money, seeing as she's been used already. Used. Like she was livestock. Ethan's fist caught Sykes in the jaw before he'd consciously decided to throw the punch. The man went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip. People came running, but Ethan didn't care. He grabbed Sykes by his shirt front and hauled him up. You listen to me, Ethan said, his voice deadly quiet. Clara Vance is under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Anyone who tries to take her back to settle debts or for any other reason will have to go through me first. We clear? Sykes nodded frantically, eyes wide. Ethan dropped him and turned to the growing crowd. That goes for all of you. The woman is mine, legally purchased, legally mine, and I protect what's mine. He bought his supplies in tense silence, aware of the stares, the whispers. Let them talk. Let them think whatever they wanted. Clara wasn't going back to Bitter Creek, not now, not ever. But the trip took longer than planned. By the time he started back up the mountain, the sun was already setting. He pushed his horse harder than he should have, driven by an urgency he couldn't quite name. Just the sense that something was wrong, that Clara needed him even though he'd left her with plenty of supplies and Thomas had been healthy. He reached the cabin well after dark. The windows were lit, lamplight spilling out into the clearing. Everything looked normal. But when he pushed open the door, he found Clara pacing with Thomas, her face streaked with tears, the baby screaming in her arms. What happened? Ethan dropped his saddlebags and crossed to her in 3 strides. Is he hurt? He won't stop crying, Clara said, her voice breaking. He's been crying for hours. I've nursed him, changed him, walked him, sung to him, everything. He won't stop and I don't know what's wrong and I thought maybe he was sick, maybe dying, maybe I failed him. Let me see. Ethan took Thomas from her shaking arms. The baby was red-faced from crying, his little fists clenched, but when Ethan felt his forehead, it was cool. No fever. His breathing was clear. He just seemed angry, frustrated, inconsolable in the way babies sometimes were for no reason anyone could name. "He's fine," Ethan said. "Clara, he's fine. Sometimes babies just cry. It doesn't mean anything's wrong. But he's been crying for so long. How long have you been holding him?" "Since noon, since you left. He's been fussy all day and then he started really crying and I thought if I put him down something would happen, that he'd—" She was shaking now, near hysteria. "I can't lose another baby. I can't. I won't survive it." Ethan understood then. This wasn't about Thomas. This was about the daughter she'd lost, about every fear and grief she'd been carrying for 6 months, all focused on this crying infant. "Sit down," he said gently. "You're exhausted. Let me take him for a while." "But, Clara..." "Sit down." She sank into the rocking chair like her strings had been cut. Ethan walked Thomas in slow circles, bouncing gently, making low shushing sounds. The baby's crying began to ease, became intermittent instead of constant. Within 10 minutes, he was quiet, heavy-eyed, drifting toward sleep. "You see?" Ethan said. "He's fine. He was probably just picking up on your worry. Babies do that." Clara was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You knew what to do." "I've been living with him for 3 months. I've learned a few things. But I'm supposed to know. I'm supposed to be taking care of him. If I can't even handle him crying..." "You've been handling him crying for a month straight. You're allowed to have a bad day." She shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. "You don't understand. I have to be perfect. I have to keep him alive. If something happens to him because I wasn't good enough, nothing's going to happen to him. You don't know that. Babies die. They die all the time for no reason, and if he dies, it'll be my fault." "Clara." Ethan laid Thomas in his cradle. The baby was fully asleep now, and knelt in front of her chair. "Thomas is not your daughter. What happened to her wasn't your fault, and if something happens to him, it won't be your fault either. You're doing everything right, more than right. He's alive because of you. But what if it's not enough? What if I fail him like I failed her? You didn't fail her. The cholera failed her. Life failed her. You survived, and that took more strength than you know." Clara was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old. Ethan did the only thing he could think of. He pulled her forward into his arms and let her cry. She fought it for a moment, went rigid against him, then collapsed into his chest and wept like the world was ending. He held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Just let her empty out 6 months of grief onto his shirt while Thomas slept peacefully in his cradle and the fire burned low. When she finally quieted, she didn't pull away immediately, just stayed there, exhausted, her forehead pressed against his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be. I tried so hard to keep it together, to just focus on Thomas and not think about, not remember." "You can't outrun grief. I've tried. Doesn't work." She laughed, a wet, broken sound. "Is that why you're up here alone, trying to outrun your dead wife?" "Something like that. How's that working for you?" "Not particularly well, especially now that my cabin's full of people again." She did pull back then, wiping her face with her hands. "I've made a mess of your shirt. I've got others." They looked at each other for a long moment. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy from crying. She looked young and old at the same time, broken and strong, everything contradictory all at once. "Thank you," she said finally, for letting me..." "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. You could have sent me back to the loft, could have told me to handle my own grief. Instead, you..." She gestured vaguely at his damp shirt, at the space between them that felt both too close and not close enough. "You're keeping my son alive," Ethan said. "The least I can do is keep you sane." She smiled then, a real smile, small and tentative but genuine. "Deal." That night marked a shift. Clara stopped trying to be perfect, stopped treating every moment with Thomas like a test she might fail. She let Ethan help more, let him hold Thomas while she cooked or cleaned or just sat and rested. She started asking questions about Sarah, about the cabin, about Ethan's life before the mountains, and Ethan found himself answering, telling her things he'd never told anyone, about the war and Denver and all the reasons he'd needed to disappear. They weren't friends exactly. The relationship was still too strange for that, too bound up in need and circumstance. But they were becoming something. Partners, maybe. Allies in the project of keeping Thomas alive and themselves functional. And Thomas thrived. By 6 weeks, he'd doubled his birth weight. By 8 weeks, he was cooing and smiling and reaching for things with his tiny hands. He recognized Clara's voice, would turn his head toward her when she entered the room. But he also smiled for Ethan now, seemed to understand that this big, quiet man was his father. Spring deepened into early summer. The garden Clara had planted sprouted green, the high meadows filled with wildflowers. Thomas started sleeping through the night, and Clara finally looked like she was getting enough rest. Everything should have been peaceful. But Ethan couldn't shake the memory of Sykes's words in Bitter Creek. People were talking. Clara's presence here wasn't secret, and there were those who'd take issue with it. For now, the isolation protected them. But come winter, when he'd need to go to town more regularly for supplies, questions would be asked. Demands might be made. He needed to find a way to protect her, legally, permanently. But the only way he could think of came with complications of its own, complications he wasn't sure either of them were ready for. So he said nothing, just watched summer arrive and tried not to think about what autumn might bring. The problem arrived on horseback in mid-July, wearing a clean suit and carrying a leather satchel that had no business being this far into the mountains. Ethan was splitting wood when he heard the rider approaching. He set down the axe and reached for his rifle, a reflex from years of living where visitors were rarely good news. From inside the cabin came the sound of Clara singing softly to Thomas, some lullaby he didn't recognize. The rider came into the clearing and reined up, looking around with the careful assessment of a man who knew he wasn't welcome. He was maybe 40, with a thin mustache and eyes that cataloged everything they touched. "Mr. Hale?" he called. Ethan didn't lower the rifle. "Who's asking?" "My name is Cordell, James Cordell. I'm an attorney from Denver, retained by the estate of Daniel Vance to settle outstanding debts." He patted his satchel. "I have papers here indicating that Mrs. Clara Vance owes approximately $200 in medical fees, funeral expenses, and unpaid rent. I'm authorized to collect on behalf of the creditors." Every muscle in Ethan's body went tight. "Mrs. Vance is under contract to me. Any debts she had were settled when I purchased that contract." "I'm afraid that's not quite accurate." Cordell dismounted, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "Mr. Sykes handled the sale irregularly. He had no legal authority to discharge Mrs. Vance's debts to third parties. The creditors have filed suit, and a judge in Denver has ruled in their favor. Mrs. Vance must either pay what's owed or return to satisfy the debt through labor. She's not going anywhere. Mr. Hale, I understand you may have developed an attachment, but the law is quite clear. If Mrs. Vance cannot pay, she must—" The cabin door opened. Clara stood in the doorway with Thomas in her arms, her face pale. "How much?" Cordell turned to her with something that might have been sympathy or might have been practiced manipulation. $217.30, Mrs. Vance. A substantial sum, I'm afraid. The creditors have been quite patient, but they insist on settlement. I don't have $200. Then I'm afraid you'll need to return to Bitter Creek to work off the debt. I have a contract here that—" "No." Ethan stepped between Cordell and the cabin. "She's not going back. I'll pay the debt." Clara made a sound of protest. "Ethan, you can't—" "I'll pay it," he repeated, not taking his eyes off Cordell. "But I want documentation. Proof that this settles everything. That no one else comes around making claims." Cordell reached into his satchel slowly, pulled out several papers. "I have the original debt documentation here, along with a release form that, once signed and payment received, will clear Mrs. Vance of all obligations. It's all perfectly legal." Ethan took the papers, scanned them. The language was dense, full of legal terms he half understood, but the numbers were clear enough. $217 and change. More than a year's worth of trapping, more than he had in ready cash. "I'll need 3 days," he said. "I have money cashed, but it'll take time to retrieve it." "I can wait 3 days." Cordell smiled thinly. "Though I'll need somewhere to stay. Perhaps the barn?" "Perhaps the trail back to Denver," Ethan said. "Come back in 3 days, same time. I'll have your money." "Mr. Hale, I really think it would be better if I—" 3 days. Something in Ethan's voice made Cordell decide not to push. He nodded, tucked his papers away, and remounted. Very well, 3 days. But if the money isn't ready, I'll have no choice but to enforce the court's ruling. He rode out. Ethan watched until he disappeared into the trees, then turned to find Clara staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. You can't pay that, she said. It's too much. It's your whole winter stake. It's done. It's not done. I won't let you bankrupt yourself for me. Would you rather go back to Bitter Creek? Work 3 years as an indentured servant to pay off debts your dead husband accumulated? I'd rather not be in debt to you instead. Ethan felt something hot flare in his chest. This isn't about debt. This is about keeping you here, where Thomas needs you. Where Thomas needs me, Clara repeated flatly. Not where you need me, not where I want to be, just where your son needs a wet nurse. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. She shifted Thomas to her other hip. The baby was watching them both with wide eyes, sensing the tension. I know what I am here, Ethan. I know my value. It's measured in ounces of milk and how long Thomas needs to nurse. The minute he doesn't need me anymore, I'm just another mouth to feed, another person taking up space in your carefully constructed solitude. You think that's all you are to me? I don't know what I am to you. You don't either. You just know you can't let me leave because Thomas would die, and you can't survive losing another child. So you'll pay $200 to keep me here, and you'll call it protection or duty or whatever helps you sleep at night, but we both know the truth. She was wrong, at least partly wrong. But Ethan couldn't find words to explain the rest of it, the part that had nothing to do with Thomas and everything to do with the way the cabin felt less empty with her in it. The way he'd started listening for her footsteps, her voice, the way she'd become essential in ways that went far beyond nursing. 3 years, Claire continued, her voice softer now. 3 years of your winter stake, gone. To pay debts I didn't even know existed. How is that fair to you? Fair doesn't enter into it. It should. Thomas started to fuss. Clara automatically began swaying, soothing him, and Ethan saw how natural the motion had become. She'd been here less than 3 months, but already she moved through his home like it was hers, knew every creak of the floorboards, every quirk of the stove. I'll get the money, Ethan said. You stay here with Thomas. When Cordell comes back, we'll settle this permanently. And then what? What do you mean? After the debts are paid, after I'm legally free, what happens then? It was the question he'd been avoiding, the one that kept him awake at night while he listened to her move around the loft, tending to Thomas when the baby woke. What happened when the last chain holding her here was broken? That's up to you, he said finally. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and went back inside. Ethan retrieved the money over the next 2 days. He had 3 caches in the mountains, savings from 6 years of trapping kept hidden because banks were too far and too unreliable. The first cache, buried beneath a lightning-struck pine in the North Meadow, held $80 in gold coins. The second, wedged in a rock crevice near the High Creek, had another $90. The third took him half a day to reach, a 3-hour ride to a box canyon where he'd built a false floor in an old trapper's shack. $120 in mixed currency, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. It was everything he'd saved, everything he'd planned to use for emergencies, for expanding the cabin, for Thomas's future. Gone in one transaction to settle debts for a woman he'd known less than a season. He should have resented it, should have felt the loss keenly. Instead, he just felt relief that he had enough. On the morning of the 3rd day, Clara met him at the barn while he was saddling his horse. "Let me come with you," she said. Ethan turned. She was wearing the same faded dress she'd worn the day he'd bought her, but she'd washed it, mended the hem. Her hair was braided back, her face set with determination. "It's better if you stay here with Thomas. Thomas is asleep, and this is my debt, my problem. I should be there when it's settled." "Clara, please." Her eyes met his. "I need to see it. Need to watch those papers get signed. Otherwise, I'll always wonder if it's really over, or if someone else is going to show up with another claim." He understood that. The need for certainty, for closure. "All right, bring Thomas. We'll make it quick." They met Cordell at the edge of the clearing an hour before noon. The lawyer had brought a camp set up this time, had clearly spent the previous nights camped nearby. He looked tired and irritated, like a man used to city comforts suffering through mountain hospitality. "Mr. Hale, Mrs. Vance?" He dismounted, withdrew his papers. "Do you have the payment?" Ethan handed over the satchel heavy with coins. Cordell counted it methodically, checking each denomination, making notes in a small leather book. It took 20 minutes. Clara stood silent beside Ethan, holding Thomas, her face expressionless. "This appears to be in order," Cordell said finally. He produced the release form, signed it with a flourish, pressed his seal to the wax. "Mrs. Vance, this document clears you of all debts related to your late husband's estate. No further claims can be made against you. You are, as of this moment, free of all legal obligations." He handed her the paper. Clara took it with shaking hands, read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it inside her dress. "Thank you," she said quietly. "My pleasure. Though I should mention—" Cordell glanced at Ethan, then back to Clara. "Your living situation here is somewhat irregular. A woman alone with a man, no legal ties. There are those who might take issue." "Those people can mind their own business," Ethan said. "Perhaps. But you should be aware that without legal protection, Mrs. Vance's position is precarious. If anything were to happen to you, Mr. Hale, she'd have no claim to this property, no rights to the child she's been caring for. The boy would go to your next of kin, and Mrs. Vance would be left with nothing." It was phrased as helpful advice, but delivered with an edge that suggested Cordell was looking for additional business. Still, the words hit home. Ethan had been so focused on keeping Clara here that he hadn't thought about what would happen if he wasn't here to protect her. "Thank you for your concern," Ethan said flatly. "We'll manage." Cordell shrugged, packed up his papers, and mounted his horse. "As you wish. Good day to you both." They watched him ride away. When he was out of sight, Clara let out a long breath. "Free," she said wonderingly. "I'm actually free. How does it feel?" She looked at him, and there was something complicated in her expression. Terrifying. That night, after Thomas was asleep and Clara had retreated to the loft, Ethan sat by the fire thinking about Cordell's words. The lawyer was right. Clara had no legal protection here. If something happened to Ethan, she'd be cast out with nothing. And Thomas would go to Ethan's brother in St. Louis, a man Ethan hadn't spoken to in 8 years. A man who'd never even met his nephew. There was one solution, one way to make Clara's position unassailable, to ensure she could stay with Thomas no matter what happened. But the thought of it made his chest tight, made him feel like he was betraying Sarah's memory, even though Sarah had been gone for months and would never have wanted her son raised by strangers. It was practical. That's all. A business arrangement to protect everyone involved. He'd ask her in the morning. But morning came and the words wouldn't come. He watched Clara feed Thomas, watched her move through the cabin like she belonged there, and couldn't figure out how to propose what he was thinking without making it sound like something it wasn't. Days passed. A week. 2. Summer deepened. The garden produced its first vegetables, lettuce and radishes, the early crops Clara had planted. Thomas learned to laugh, a sound that filled the cabin with something Ethan hadn't realized was missing. Clara started smiling more, the grief lines around her mouth softening into something that might eventually be peace, and Ethan kept finding reasons not to have the conversation he knew they needed. Then the weather changed. It started with a shift in the wind, a coolness that shouldn't have arrived until September. Ethan felt it one morning in late July and immediately started checking his supplies, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The sky was clear, but the animals were skittish. Birds flew in wrong patterns. The horses kept looking toward the high peaks, ears pricked forward. "Storm coming?" he told Clara at breakfast. She looked out the window at the brilliant sunshine. "Doesn't look like rain." "Not rain, something else. I can feel it." He'd learned to trust those feelings in his years in the mountains, had survived blizzards and flash floods and rock slides by paying attention when his gut said danger was close. He spent the day preparing, brought extra firewood onto the porch, checked the barn roof, reinforced the chicken coop, brought in water from the well, filled every container they had, moved the mules into the barn with the horses, gave all the animals extra feed. Clara watched him with increasing concern. "Ethan, what are you preparing for?" "I don't know, but it's coming." That night, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. By midnight, frost covered the ground. By dawn, it was snowing. Not a light dusting, not an early flurry, a full blizzard, the kind that belonged in January, not July. Wind howled down from the peaks, driving snow horizontally across the clearing. Within hours, visibility dropped to nothing. The world outside the windows became a white void. Ethan had seen freak storms before, but never like this. Never this early, never this fierce. He kept the fire burning high, stuffed rags in the cracks around the door and windows. The temperature inside the cabin dropped despite his efforts. They could see their breath. "Is this normal?" Clara asked, holding Thomas close under a pile of blankets. "No, this is wrong, all wrong." The storm raged for 2 days. Snow piled against the cabin walls, threatening to cover the windows. Ethan went out twice to check the animals, fighting through waist-deep drifts to reach the barn. The second time, he nearly didn't make it back. The wind was strong enough to knock him down, the cold vicious enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. "Don't go out again," Clara said when he stumbled back inside, ice crusted on his beard. "If the animals die, they die. I'm not losing you to this." He was too cold to argue, just stripped off his frozen outer layers and huddled by the fire until feeling returned to his hands. On the third night, Thomas got sick. It started with fussing, the baby refusing to nurse properly. Then came a cough, wet and rattling. By midnight, he was burning with fever, his tiny chest heaving with each breath. Clara walked him, rocked him, tried to get him to drink. Nothing helped. The cough got worse. The fever climbed higher. Thomas's eyes were glassy, unfocused. His lips had a bluish tinge. "We need a doctor," Clara said, her voice edged with panic. "There's no doctor within 2 days' ride. And we can't travel in this." "Then what do we do?" Ethan didn't have an answer. He'd seen children die from fever, from lung sickness, had seen how fast it could take them, especially babies as young as Thomas. "Steam," he said finally. "We need steam to help him breathe, boil water, hang wet cloths near the fire, and willow bark tea, if we can get him to swallow it." They worked through the night. Ethan kept water boiling, creating clouds of steam that filled the cabin. Clara held Thomas upright against her chest, trying to get the moist air into his struggling lungs. When Ethan brought the willow bark tea, bitter and probably useless but the only medicine he had, she dipped her finger in it and let Thomas suck the drops from her skin. Hours blurred together. The storm howled outside. Inside, they fought for Thomas's life with steam and hope and sheer stubborn refusal to let him go. Around dawn of the fourth day, Thomas's breathing eased slightly. The fever didn't break, but it stopped climbing. Clara, exhausted beyond measure, finally let herself believe he might survive. "Talk to me," she said to Ethan. "If I fall asleep, I'll drop him." So Ethan talked, told her about growing up in Missouri, about the war, about things he'd never spoken of to anyone, about the first man he'd killed, about the nightmares that still woke him sometimes, about meeting Sarah in Denver and thinking maybe he could be normal, could have a regular life. "She deserved better than me," he said. "Deserved better than dying alone in a cabin while her husband couldn't save her." "You can't save everyone," Clara said. She was swaying with Thomas, the motion automatic now. "Sometimes people die and it's not anyone's fault. It just is. Like your husband. Like my husband. Like my baby." She looked down at Thomas. "But not this one. This one we're keeping." "We?" Ethan repeated. "Yes, we. You think I'm doing this alone? You've been up all night boiling water, making tea, keeping this cabin warm enough that we don't all freeze. That's not a wet nurse's job. That's a father's job." "And a mother's," Ethan said quietly. Clara's hand stilled on Thomas's back. She didn't look up. "I'm not his mother." "You've said that before. I'm starting to think you're the only one who believes it. Believing anything else is dangerous." "Why?" "Because—" The word came out sharp, loud enough to make Thomas stir. Clara softened her voice immediately, went back to swaying. "Because I already lost one child. I can't. I won't." She stopped. "I won't let myself love him like that. Won't let myself believe he's mine. Because he's not. He's yours and Sarah's. I'm just the woman keeping him alive until he doesn't need me anymore." And what if I want you to be more than that?" The question hung between them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The fire crackled. Thomas breathed in and out, each breath a small victory. "Don't," Clara whispered. "Please don't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because I can't. I'm not ready to—" She looked up at him finally, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know what you're going to ask. I heard what Cordell said about legal protection and Thomas's future. I know the practical solution. But I can't, Ethan. I can't marry you just to make the paperwork cleaner." He hadn't been going to propose, or maybe he had. He honestly didn't know anymore. "I'm not asking you to marry me," he said. "Good. But I'm asking you to stay, after Thomas is weaned, after he doesn't need you to survive. I'm asking you to stay anyway." "Why?" It was a simple question with no simple answer. Why did he want her to stay? Because Thomas needed her? Because the cabin felt right with her in it? Because somewhere in the past 3 months she'd stopped being the broken woman he'd bought and become someone he couldn't imagine living without? "Because you belong here," he said finally. "Because this is your home now, whether you want it to be or not. Because walking into this cabin and finding it empty except for me and Thomas would break something I didn't know I had left to break." Clara was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face. "That's not fair." "I know. I'm not Sarah. I'll never be Sarah." "I don't want you to be Sarah. I want you to be Clara." Complicated, stubborn, grief-struck Clara who saves babies and plants gardens and refuses to admit when she cares about something. "I do care," she whispered. "That's the problem. I care so much it terrifies me. I look at Thomas and I see my daughter. I look at you and I see Daniel. I see everyone I've lost and everyone I could lose, and it makes me want to run before the losing starts again. What if you stayed instead? What if I stay and you die? Or Thomas dies? Or I die? What then? Then we'll have had the time we had. Isn't that better than running now and having nothing?" Thomas chose that moment to cough, a harsh sound that broke the spell. Clara immediately focused back on him, checking his temperature, his breathing. The fever had dropped slightly. His color was a bit better. "We should try to feed him," she said, not looking at Ethan. "If he can keep milk down, that's a good sign." She was changing the subject, running away from the conversation without actually leaving the room. Ethan let her. They'd said enough for one night. He'd asked her to stay and she hadn't said no. That would have to be enough. Thomas nursed weakly, fell back into feverish sleep. The storm finally began to ease as the sun came up, the wind dying to a whisper, the snow tapering to scattered flakes. By the 5th day, the storm had passed completely. The world outside was buried under 3 feet of snow, the temperature still far below normal for July. But the sky was clear, the sun bright on the impossible whiteness. Thomas's fever broke that afternoon. He woke hungry and cranky, nursed with his old fierce determination, and promptly fell into the deepest sleep he'd had since getting sick. "He's going to be fine," Clara said, touching her lips to his forehead. "The fever's gone." Ethan, who'd been awake for nearly 100 hours straight, felt his knees go weak with relief. He sat down hard in the nearest chair. "You should sleep," Clara said. "So should you." "I will, but first—" She looked at him, and her face was different somehow. The walls she'd built had cracks in them. "Thank you for fighting with me to keep him alive, for not giving up when it got hard. I could say the same to you." "We make a good team," she said quietly. "Yes, we do." She carried Thomas to the cradle, laid him down with infinite care. Then she turned back to Ethan. "I'll stay," she said. "After Thomas is weaned, I'll stay, if you still want me to." Relief and something else, something that felt dangerously like joy, flooded through him. "I'll want you to. But we need rules, boundaries. I'm not ready for more than—" She struggled for words. "I can take care of Thomas. I can run your household. I can be your friend, your partner in keeping this place running. But anything beyond that, anything romantic or— I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever." "I understand." "Do you? Because I don't want you to have expectations. Don't want to disappoint you when I can't be what you need. You're already what I need," Ethan said. "You and Thomas. That's enough." She studied his face for a long moment, looking for the lie, the hidden expectation. When she didn't find it, something in her expression softened. "All right then," she said. "We'll try this. See if it works." "It'll work." "You sound very certain." "I am certain. We just survived a freak blizzard and a dying baby. After that, normal life should be easy." Clara laughed, the sound surprised out of her. "You really believe that?" "I have to believe something." The snow melted over the next week, the temperature climbing back to summer normal as if the storm had never happened. But something had shifted. Clara stopped sleeping in the loft, moved instead to the space behind a curtain Ethan hung in the corner of the main room. Closer to Thomas, she said, easier for night feedings, but also closer to Ethan, close enough that they fell into the rhythm of a shared life. She started calling him by his first name without the hesitation she'd had before. Started asking his opinion on household decisions instead of just handling everything herself. Started, slowly and carefully, to let herself be part of the small family they were building. And Ethan started to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd survive this. That maybe the three of them, a mountain man, a grieving widow, and a baby who'd refused to die, could make something that looked like a future. But summer was ending. Autumn would bring its own challenges, and the question Cordell had planted about legal protection still lingered, unanswered, growing more urgent with every day that Clara allowed herself to hope. The question came in September, carried on the same lawyer's polished voice that had brought trouble before. Ethan was mending fence line when he saw the rider approaching, and his stomach dropped even before he recognized Cordell's distinctive bay mare. The lawyer had no business being back here unless something had gone wrong, unless someone had found another loophole, another way to threaten the fragile peace they'd built. He walked back to the cabin without hurrying, giving himself time to prepare, to build the walls he'd need to face whatever was coming. Clara was on the porch with Thomas, who'd just turned 5 months old and was sitting up on his own now, grabbing at everything within reach with delighted concentration. "Company," Ethan said quietly, and saw Clara's face go pale. "Who?" "Cordell." Her hands tightened on Thomas. "I paid the debts. He said I was clear." "I know." The lawyer rode into the clearing with the same careful neutrality he'd shown before, but this time there was something else in his expression. Wariness, maybe, or calculation. "Mr. Hale? Mrs. Vance." He dismounted, keeping his hands visible and away from his coat. "I apologize for the intrusion. I have a matter of some urgency to discuss." "We're done with lawyers," Ethan said. "I understand your reluctance, but this concerns the legal status of your son, and I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." Thomas chose that moment to let out a happy shriek, reaching for a leaf that had blown onto the porch. Clara pulled him back automatically, her body curved protectively around him. "Say what you came to say," Ethan told Cordell. "Then leave." The lawyer pulled papers from his satchel with movements that were becoming familiar. "I've been contacted by your brother in St. Louis, Robert Hale. He's filed a petition with the territorial court claiming that your son is being raised in an improper environment and requesting custody." The words hit like a fist to the gut. Robert has no claim to Thomas. Actually, as your closest living relative and Thomas's uncle, he has significant legal standing, particularly given the circumstances of the child's care. Cordell's eyes flicked to Clara. "A woman living with you outside of marriage, nursing your child. Your brother's attorney has painted it in rather unflattering terms. Robert hasn't seen me in 8 years. He doesn't care about Thomas." "Perhaps not, but he does care about your late wife's inheritance. Sarah Hale came from a prosperous Denver family, did she not? They left her a considerable sum, held in trust for her children. If Thomas were to come under your brother's guardianship, he would control that trust until the boy comes of age." So it was about money. Of course it was. Robert had always been a man who measured value in dollars, who saw family as assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. The idea of him raising Thomas, teaching him to see the world as something to be exploited rather than experienced, made Ethan's blood run cold. "He's not taking my son. I'm afraid he has a strong case. An unmarried woman of questionable background caring for an infant, living in isolation with the child's father. The court will see that as morally compromising at best, dangerous at worst. Your brother is proposing a stable home in the city, education, proper society. Unless you can demonstrate that Thomas's current situation is legally and morally sound, the judge will likely rule in Robert's favor." Clara had gone very still. "Thomas, sensing something wrong, stopped playing with the leaf and looked up at her with worried eyes. "What would demonstrate that?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Marriage," Cordell said simply. "If Mrs. Vance were your wife, the situation would be entirely proper. A widow and widower finding companionship, raising a child together. Even the nursing would be seen as natural maternal care rather than an irregular arrangement. Your brother would have no grounds for his petition. And if we don't marry? Then I'd give Robert's attorneys better than even odds of winning custody, particularly if they can demonstrate any evidence of impropriety or moral laxness in Thomas's upbringing." The threat was clear. Marry Clara or lose Thomas. Give up the boundaries they'd established, the careful distance they'd maintained, or watch his brother take his son to St. Louis and raise him to be everything Ethan despised. "When does Robert need an answer?" Ethan asked. "The hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from now in Denver. If you intend to contest the petition, you'll need to appear before the judge with evidence that Thomas is in a stable, morally appropriate home." Cordell tucked his papers away. "I've drafted marriage documents, should you choose that route. They're standard territorial contracts, nothing unusual. I can file them with the court and provide testimony about the arrangement." "You seem very helpful for a man who was trying to collect Clara's debts 2 months ago." Cordell had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm paid to represent clients' interests. In this case, I believe Robert Hale's claim is unjust, and I dislike seeing the law used to separate a father from his son. Consider this pro bono advice." He held out a sheaf of papers. Ethan took them automatically, scanning the dense legal language. Standard marriage contract, as Cordell had said. Binding Clara to him, making her Thomas's legal mother, protecting both of them under law. Trapping her in a life she'd explicitly said she wasn't ready for. "I'll need to discuss this with Mrs. Vance," Ethan said. "Of course, but time is limited. The documents need to be filed within the week for the court to consider them valid at the hearing." Cordell remounted, tipped his hat, and rode away. Ethan stood holding the papers while Clara sat frozen on the porch, Thomas squirming in her arms. "I should feed him," she said finally, her voice very distant. "He's getting fussy." She carried Thomas inside. Ethan followed, closing the door behind them and setting the marriage contract on the table like it was something that might explode. Clara settled into the rocking chair and began nursing, her movements mechanical, her eyes fixed on something far away. Thomas nursed contentedly, unaware that his entire future was being decided in the silence between the 2 adults who cared for him. "We don't have to do this," Ethan said quietly. "There might be another way. I could go to Denver, hire my own lawyer, fight Robert in court." "And say what? That having an unmarried woman nurse your child is completely normal and appropriate?" Clara's laugh was bitter. "You heard Cordell. The court will side with your brother unless we can prove Thomas is in a proper home. And proper means married parents." "You said you weren't ready for marriage, that you might never be ready." "I'm not. But that's not really relevant anymore, is it?" "It's relevant to me." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were hard. Don't pretend this is about what I want or what you want. This is about Thomas. About keeping him safe from a man who sees him as access to money. We both know what we have to do. I won't force you into a marriage you don't want." "You're not forcing me. The situation is forcing me. There's a difference." She shifted Thomas to her other breast. "I've been sold once already this year. At least this time I'm choosing to go willingly. This isn't the same thing. Isn't it? I'm trading my freedom for security, my independence for legal protection." "How is that different from what happened in Bitter Creek?" "Because I'm not Sykes," Ethan wanted to say. "Because this isn't about owning you, it's about protecting you." But the words felt hollow even in his own head. A marriage contract was still a contract, still a document that gave him legal authority over her life in ways that made his skin crawl. "What if we made it different?" he said slowly. "What if we drew up our own terms, separate from the legal contract? An agreement between us about how this marriage would actually work?" Clara's hand stilled on Thomas's back. "What kind of agreement?" "The kind where you keep your independence, where you have equal say in household decisions, in how Thomas is raised, in everything, where this is a partnership, not ownership. The law won't see it that way. Once we're married, you have legal authority over me whether we agree to it or not. The law is one thing. What we agree to between ourselves is another. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. I meant what I said before. I'm not asking you to be Sarah. I'm not asking you to be anything except yourself. If marriage is what we need to keep Thomas, then we'll get married. But it doesn't have to change anything else. Everything changes when you sign a contract. It doesn't have to. Thomas finished nursing and fell asleep against Clara's chest. She held him for a long moment, her face buried in his soft baby hair, and when she looked up, her expression was carefully neutral. I want my own room, she said, not a curtained-off corner, a real room with a door that locks from the inside. I'll build one. And I want control over the household money, not asking permission for every purchase, but actual control, a budget that I manage. Done. And if I decide to leave, if Thomas is weaned and I want to go, you don't try to stop me. The marriage can be dissolved and I walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else. That one hurt. The idea of her leaving, of the cabin being empty again, of Thomas losing the only mother he'd ever really known. But Ethan forced himself to nod. Agreed, though I hope you won't want to leave. I might not, but I need to know I can. She stood, still holding Thomas. I need to know that I'm choosing this every day, not trapped in it because of a piece of paper. You'll always have that choice. I swear it. Clara crossed to the window, looked out at the mountains turning gold with autumn. Your brother. Tell me about him. The change of subject threw Ethan off balance. Why? Because if we're doing this to keep Thomas away from him, I should know what kind of man we're fighting. Fair enough. Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to find words for a relationship he'd spent years trying to forget. Robert is 3 years older than me. Growing up, he was the responsible one, the one who followed rules, met expectations, made our parents proud. I was the one who ran wild, who questioned everything, who couldn't sit still in church or school or anywhere civilized. Sounds familiar, Clara murmured, and there might have been the ghost of a smile on her lips. When the war came, Robert stayed home. Said someone needed to manage the family business, take care of our parents. I enlisted. Spent 3 years fighting, came back different, harder. Robert looked at me like I was a stranger, like the war had burned away whatever brother he remembered and left something else in my place. Maybe it had. It had. After our parents died, Robert inherited everything, offered to let me work in the business, but we both knew it would never work. I took my share of the inheritance and came west. Met Sarah in Denver, built this cabin, tried to become someone who could live a normal life. Did it work? For a while. Sarah made it work, really. She had this way of making everything feel possible, like the past didn't matter as much as the future we were building. Then she got pregnant and things got hard. The isolation she'd loved became loneliness. The peace became boredom. By the end, she hated it here, hated me for bringing her. Clara turned from the window. You can't know that. She told me. 3 days before she died, burning with fever, she told me this place had killed her. That if we'd stayed in Denver near doctors and hospitals, she'd have survived. That I'd chosen my need for solitude over her life. She was sick, dying. People say things when they're in that much pain. Doesn't make them less true. Thomas stirred in Clara's arms, made a small sound but didn't wake. She swayed automatically, soothing him back into deeper sleep. Your brother, she said. What kind of man is he now? Rich, successful, everything society considers respectable. He married well, has 2 children of his own, lives in a house with servants and fancy furniture. Probably thinks raising Thomas would be easy, just another child in the nursery for the governess to manage. And the money? Sarah's inheritance? Held in trust by a Denver bank. Sarah's parents left it for their grandchildren with specific instructions about how it should be used. Education, medical care, eventually business opportunities. It's a substantial sum. Maybe $20,000. Clara's eyes widened. And your brother would control it? As Thomas's guardian, yes. He'd make all decisions about how the money was spent until Thomas turned 21. Plenty of ways to skim a little here and there, make investments that benefit Robert more than Thomas. By the time my son came of age, that $20,000 might be considerably less. So this isn't about Thomas's welfare at all. Robert would tell you it is, would probably even believe it. He's very good at convincing himself that what benefits him financially is also morally right. But no, this is about money and control. Two things my brother values above all else. Clara looked down at Thomas, at the baby who was worth $20,000 to a man who'd never met him. We can't let him win. No, we can't. Then I'll marry you. She said it flatly, without emotion, like agreeing to a business transaction, which, Ethan supposed, was exactly what it was. Draw up your agreement about how we'll actually live. Make it as specific as you need to. I'll sign both documents and we'll go to Denver and tell the judge that Thomas has two parents who love him and a proper home. Clara, don't thank me. This isn't noble or romantic. This is practical. I'm protecting a baby I've grown to care about from a man who sees him as profit. That's all. But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. This was Clara choosing to bind herself legally to a man she barely knew, to give up the freedom she'd just won, to risk everything on the belief that Ethan would keep his word about honoring her independence. It was trust, fragile and new and terrifying. That night, Ethan sat up late writing out the agreement Clara had requested. He wasn't a lawyer, didn't know the proper language or format, but he wrote what seemed fair, what seemed like the kind of marriage that could work without destroying both of them. Clara would have her own room with a lock. She would control all household finances and domestic decisions. She would have equal say in Thomas's upbringing and education. She could leave at any time with no legal or financial penalty and would receive enough money to establish herself independently. The marriage would be one of partnership and mutual respect, with no expectations beyond what they both agreed to. He added one more clause, surprising himself. If either of them wished to pursue affection or romance outside the marriage, they would discuss it honestly with the other first. He didn't expect to want anyone else, couldn't imagine it. But Clara might. Someday, when her grief had eased and the walls around her heart had cracked enough to let someone in, she might meet someone who made her feel things Ethan never could. He wanted her to have that option, wanted her to know he wouldn't stand in the way of her happiness. He showed her the agreement the next morning. She read it twice, her expression unreadable, then looked up at him with something that might have been surprise. This clause about seeing other people, you're serious? I am. You'd let me, while we're married, you'd allow I'm not asking you to love me, Clara. If you find someone who makes you happy, someone you can actually choose without desperation or circumstance forcing your hand, I won't stop you. And you? The same clause applies to you. I suppose it does. She set the papers down carefully. I don't want this clause. Ethan's stomach dropped. If you want different terms, I want it gone entirely. If we're married, we're married. I won't have you keeping one foot out the door, watching for someone better to come along. And I won't keep one foot out either. That's not how marriage works. I'm trying to give you freedom. I know. But some freedoms aren't worth having. If I'm doing this, if I'm signing a contract that binds me to you, then I'm doing it completely. No escape clauses beyond the one about leaving entirely. Either we make this marriage real or we don't do it at all. She was right. Half measures wouldn't work, wouldn't convince a judge, wouldn't protect Thomas. If they were going to do this, they needed to commit fully, even if that commitment was built on practicality rather than love. Ethan crossed out the clause about seeing other people. Anything else you want changed? Just one thing. I want a clause about the baby. Thomas? And any others. If we're married and living together, it's possible I might. She stopped, started again. I want it in writing that any child born during this marriage is legitimate and has the same rights as Thomas, including rights to your property, your name, everything. The implication hit him like cold water. She was talking about the possibility of them having children together, of their marriage becoming real in all the ways that mattered. Clara, I'm not expecting, I wouldn't ask you to, I know, but we're both young enough that it could happen, expect it or not. And if it does, I want my child protected. I want it in writing. Ethan added the clause, his hand not quite steady. The idea of Clara pregnant, of her carrying his child, was too complicated to examine. So he didn't. Just wrote the words and moved on. They signed the documents the next day. Cordell witnessed the signatures, filed the papers with the territorial court, and provided a letter attesting to the marriage's legitimacy. Just like that, Clara Vance became Clara Hale. A wife, again. A mother legally as well as practically. She didn't look happy about it, but she didn't look miserable either, just resigned, like someone who'd made a difficult choice
and would live with the consequences. The hearing in Denver was scheduled for October 5th, 3 weeks away. That gave Ethan time to build Clara's room, to extend the cabin enough that she'd have the private space she'd demanded.
He worked from dawn to dusk, fitting logs, chinking gaps, building a door with a lock that worked smoothly. Clara watched the room take shape with something that might have been hope or might have been sadness. Hard to tell with her. She was better at hiding her feelings now, had rebuilt the walls that had cracked during Thomas's illness. "It's a good room," she said when it was finished. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She moved her things from behind the curtain to the new space. A bed, a trunk with her few possessions, a chair by the window. It was sparse, but it was hers, private and separate from Ethan's life, even while being part of the same house. That night, their first as a legally married couple, they ate dinner in silence and went to their separate rooms without ceremony. No wedding night, no pretense of romance, just two people who'd made a deal to protect a child, trying to figure out how to live with what they'd done. But in the morning, Thomas woke laughing. He'd started laughing recently, full belly laughs at things only he found funny. The sound filled the cabin, dispelling some of the awkwardness, and when Clara brought him out for his morning feeding, she was almost smiling. "Good morning," Ethan said. "Good morning," she replied. Then carefully, "Husband. Wife." They looked at each other for a long moment, testing out the words, the new reality. Then Thomas reached for Ethan with both hands, and the moment passed, replaced by the ordinary chaos of caring for an infant who was growing faster than seemed possible. The days before Denver were busy. Ethan needed to arrange for someone to watch the animals while they were gone. Clara needed to prepare Thomas for travel, to pack everything a 5-month-old baby might need for a journey. They worked together with new efficiency, partners in a project neither of them had chosen, but both were committed to seeing through. 3 days before they were set to leave, a letter arrived. Ethan recognized his brother's handwriting on the envelope and felt his jaw tighten. "What does he say?" Clara asked. Ethan opened it, read quickly. "He's heard about the marriage. Says he knows it's a fraud, a desperate attempt to appear respectable. Says the judge will see through it, that no woman would willingly marry me and bury herself in the mountains unless she was being coerced or paid. We're not, I know. But Robert's good at making reasonable things sound sinister. He'll paint you as either a victim of my manipulation or a gold digger after Thomas's inheritance. Either way, he'll argue you're unfit to be Thomas's mother." Clara's face had gone pale. "What can we do?" "We can tell the truth, that you saved Thomas's life, that you've been his mother in every way that matters for 5 months, that this marriage might have started as practicality, but it's real nonetheless." "Is it real? We sleep in separate rooms, we barely touch, we're business partners raising a child together, not husband and wife." "What do you want us to be?" The question hung in the air. Clara looked down at Thomas, who was playing with a wooden horse Ethan had carved, babbling contentedly to himself. "I want us to be whatever keeps him safe," she said finally, "whatever that looks like." On the morning they left for Denver, Ethan woke to find Clara already up, packing the last of their supplies. She'd dressed carefully, in the best dress she owned, still worn and faded, but clean and mended with meticulous care. "Ready?" he asked. "No, but we're going anyway." They loaded the wagon, settled Thomas in a nest of blankets, and started down the mountain as the sun rose. It would take 2 days to reach Denver, 2 days of travel with a baby who hated sitting still and a wife who barely spoke except to Thomas. But on the second night, camped beside the trail with Thomas asleep between them, Clara finally broke the silence. "If we lose," she said quietly, "if the judge gives Thomas to your brother, what happens to us?" "We fight, appeal, refuse to hand him over." "That's not a real answer." Ethan looked at her across the fire. "The real answer? I don't know. If Robert takes Thomas, this marriage has no purpose. You'd be free to leave, to dissolve the contract and start over somewhere else. I wouldn't stop you. And if we win, then we keep doing what we're doing, raising Thomas, being partners, making this work. For how long? As long as it needs to work. As long as you're willing to stay." Clara was quiet for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers. Then so softly he almost missed it. "I'm not ready to care about you the way you probably want me to. Not ready to let myself need you or depend on you or any of those things that got torn away when Daniel died. But I'm here. I'm choosing to be here. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Ethan said. She looked at him then, really looked, and in her eyes he saw the same careful hope he felt. The sense that maybe, just maybe, they were building something that could last. Not love, not yet, and maybe not ever, but something else. Something solid enough to weather whatever came next. They reached Denver the following afternoon, dusty and exhausted. The city sprawled along the river, a mix of permanent buildings and tent structures, prosperous and desperate living side by side. Ethan found them rooms at a boarding house run by a widow who didn't ask questions about the worn-looking couple with the baby. The hearing was set for the next morning. That night, Ethan lay awake in the narrow bed listening to Thomas fuss in the adjoining room, listening to Clara soothe him with whispers and songs, and tried to prepare himself for facing his brother after 8 years of silence. Tried to prepare himself for the possibility of losing his son. But mostly he thought about Clara's words by the fire, about her choosing to be here, choosing him and Thomas despite everything she'd lost and everything she still carried. It wasn't love, but it was something, a foundation they could build on if they survived tomorrow. If they survived, everything would change again. The marriage that had started as pretense would have to become real, would have to be lived in every day with all its awkwardness and unspoken complications. But if they lost, if Robert won, then everything they'd built would shatter, and Ethan wasn't sure any of them would survive the breaking. In the next room, Thomas quieted. Clara's soft humming continued for a while longer, then faded. Silence settled over the boarding house. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight there was only waiting, hoping, and the fragile belief that sometimes choosing to fight was enough to win. The courthouse was a stolid brick building that tried too hard to look important. Ethan stood on the steps with Clara beside him, Thomas heavy in her arms, and felt the same gut-twisting anxiety he'd known before battles during the war. The difference was that back then, he'd only had his own life to lose. "We should go in," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her free hand kept smoothing Thomas's blanket over and over, a nervous gesture she probably didn't realize she was making. "In a minute." He needed one more moment of this, the three of them together, outside, with the option of running still theoretically available. Once they walked through those doors, everything would be decided by a man in black robes who'd never met any of them and didn't care about anything except the law. "Ethan." Clara touched his arm the first time she'd reached for him voluntarily. "We have to do this." She was right. Delaying wouldn't change anything. He nodded and they climbed the steps together. The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, with wooden benches and tall windows that let in autumn light. A handful of people were already seated, court officials, a clerk scratching notes, and in the front row, a man Ethan recognized despite the years and expensive tailoring. Robert Hale looked prosperous. Everything about him screamed success, from his perfectly trimmed beard to his polished shoes. He sat with the confident posture of a man who expected to get what he wanted, and when he turned to look at Ethan, his expression was carefully neutral. "Brother," Robert said, standing, "it's been a long time." "Not long enough." Robert's eyes moved to Clara, then to Thomas, and something flickered in his face. Surprise, maybe. The baby was clearly healthy, clearly well cared for, not the neglected child his lawyers had probably painted. "And you must be the new Mrs. Haley," Robert said smoothly. "My condolences on your first husband's passing. Cholera, I understand. Terrible disease." "Thank you," Clara said, her voice cool. "And this is Thomas." Robert stepped closer, and Ethan had to fight the urge to move between them. "He's grown since the photograph I was sent. Looks healthy." "He is healthy," Clara said. "No thanks to the people who tried to take him before I arrived." Robert's eyebrow lifted. "Interesting. My information suggested the child was dying, that my brother had resorted to desperate measures to save him, including purchasing a wet nurse at auction." "Your information was incomplete," Ethan said. "Clara saved Thomas's life. She's his mother now, legally and in every other way that matters. A convenient marriage, performed just weeks before this hearing. Some might call that suspicious." "Some might call filing for custody of a nephew you've never met suspicious," Clara shot back. especially when that nephew comes with a $20,000 inheritance. The door behind them opened and the judge entered, a gray-haired man with the worn look of someone who'd seen too many ugly custody battles. Everyone stood as he took his seat, and Ethan felt his last chance to run evaporate. "Be seated," the judge said. "I've reviewed the petition filed by Robert Hale seeking custody of his nephew, Thomas Ethan Hale, currently in the care of his father, Ethan Hale, and stepmother, Clara Hale. I've also reviewed the response brief arguing against the petition. This is not a trial, but I will hear statements from both parties before making my decision." Robert's lawyer stood, a sharp-faced man who probably charged more per hour than Ethan made in a month. "Your Honor, my client's concerns are straightforward. Thomas Hale is being raised in an isolated mountain cabin by a father who has demonstrated instability and poor judgment, and a stepmother of questionable character who was literally purchased at a debt auction. The child's best interests would be served by placement in my client's stable, prosperous home in St. Louis, where he would have access to education, society, and proper moral guidance. And control of his inheritance," Ethan said before he could stop himself. The judge's eyes cut to him. "You'll have your chance to speak, Mr. Hale. Continue, counselor." The lawyer did, painting a picture of Ethan as a recluse who'd let his first wife die from neglect, who'd resorted to buying a woman to care for his child, who was unfit to raise a boy who deserved better. He produced affidavits from Sykes describing the auction, from the wet nurses who'd failed to save Thomas describing the cabin's isolation, from townspeople in Bitter Creek who speculated about the impropriety of Clara's position. It was damning. Even knowing the truth, hearing it presented this way made Ethan sound like either a fool or a monster. When the lawyer finished, the judge turned to Ethan. "Your response?" Ethan stood slowly. He'd never been good with words, had always preferred action to argument, but for Thomas, he'd find the words somehow. "Your Honor, my brother hasn't seen me in 8 years. He's never met my son. He didn't attend my wedding to Sarah, didn't send condolences when she died, didn't offer help when Thomas was sick. His sudden interest in his nephew's welfare coincides exactly with his discovery of Sarah's inheritance. That's not coincidence. Can you prove your brother's motives are financial?" the judge asked. "No, but I can prove that Thomas is thriving in our care, that he's healthy and happy and loved, that taking him away from the only mother he's ever known would be cruel and unnecessary." "The only mother he's ever known," the lawyer interjected, "is a woman his father bought for $20 and married out of desperation to legitimize an irregular arrangement." "I married her because I love her," Ethan said, and felt Clara's sharp intake of breath beside him. "Because she saved my son when everyone else had given up. Because she's the strongest, most capable person I've ever met, and Thomas is lucky to have her as his mother." It was the first time he'd said it out loud. The first time he'd admitted, even to himself, that what he felt for Clara had moved beyond partnership into something deeper. He didn't look at her, couldn't bear to see her reaction, just kept his eyes on the judge. "Strong words," the judge said. "But words are easy. Mrs. Hale, I'd like to hear from you." Clara stood, still holding Thomas. The baby had been remarkably quiet through the proceedings, but now he started to fuss, turning his face toward Clara's chest. She soothed him automatically, swaying in that way that had become second nature. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was stronger than Ethan had expected. "Everything Mr. Hale's lawyer said about me is true. I was sold at a debt auction. I was bought by a man I'd never met and taken to an isolated cabin to work. By any normal measure, I shouldn't be standing here as Thomas's mother." Robert's lawyer smiled, sensing victory, but Clara wasn't finished. "But nothing about my situation has been normal since the day I arrived. I heard Thomas crying and I knew that sound. Knew it from losing my own child 6 months earlier. Knew it meant he was starving and nobody could figure out why. So I did something desperate and probably crazy. I tried to nurse him even though I had no reason to think it would work." She shifted Thomas in her arms. It did work. My body remembered what it was supposed to do, and Thomas latched on like he'd been waiting for me all along. That baby in my arms right now is alive because of milk my body made for a daughter who died before she could drink it. You can call that irregular or improper or whatever legal term makes you comfortable, but I call it a miracle. The judge's expression had softened slightly. "And the marriage to Mr. Hale started as practicality. I won't lie about that. We married to protect Thomas from exactly this kind of challenge. But somewhere between signing those papers and standing here today, it became real. I choose to be Thomas's mother. I choose to be Ethan's wife. Nobody forced me. Nobody bought me this time. This is my choice. Thomas chose that moment to grab a fistful of Clara's hair and yank, hard. She winced, but laughed, gently untangling his fingers, and the sound of her laughter, so rare, so genuine, cut through the courtroom's formality like sunlight through storm clouds. "I'd like to see the child," the judge said. "Mrs. Hale, would you bring him here?" Clara approached the bench. Thomas looked up at the judge with wide, curious eyes, then reached out one chubby hand and grabbed the man's nose. The judge, to his credit, didn't recoil, just carefully removed the baby's hand and studied him closely. "He appears healthy, well-fed, alert, appropriately developed for his age. You've been nursing him for how long?" 5 months, Your Honor. "And he takes no other sustenance?" "He's starting to eat some soft foods, mashed vegetables, bread soaked in milk, but he still nurses several times a day." The judge looked at Robert. "Mr. Hale, if I were to grant you custody, how would you handle the child's feeding? He's clearly still dependent on nursing." Robert's lawyer jumped in. "We would hire a wet nurse in St. Louis, Your Honor. There are agencies that specialize in such placements." "So you would separate this child from the woman who's been nursing him for 5 months, the only mother he knows, and hand him to a stranger?" The judge's voice had gone cold. "And you believe that serves the child's best interests?" "It serves his long-term interests, Your Honor. A stable home, proper education." "What about his short-term interest in not being traumatized by separation from his primary caregiver?" The judge waved his hand dismissively. "I've heard enough. Mrs. Hale, you may return to your seat." Clara walked back and Ethan saw her hands were shaking. He wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but didn't know if she'd accept it after what he'd said about loving her. So he just sat rigid and waited while the judge shuffled papers and made notes that might determine all their futures. "I'm going to speak plainly," the judge said finally. "This is not a complicated case, regardless of how it's been presented. A father is raising his son with the help of his new wife. The child is healthy and well cared for. The only question is whether the father's choices, his living situation, his marriage, his lifestyle, are so harmful to the child that removal is warranted." He looked directly at Robert. "Mr. Hale, I don't doubt that you could provide material advantages your brother cannot. A fine house, good schools, social connections. But children need more than material comfort. They need stability, consistency, love. You're proposing to tear a 5-month-old baby away from the only mother he's ever known, transport him hundreds of miles to a strange city, and hand him to hired caregivers. That is not stability." "Your Honor, with respect, I'm not finished. I've read the affidavits about Mrs. Hale's background. Yes, she was sold at a debt auction. Yes, the marriage appears rushed. But I've also seen her with that child. I've watched how naturally she handles him, how he responds to her. That's not something you can fake or buy. That's a bond formed over months of care." The judge shuffled more papers. "Furthermore, I find the timing of your petition suspicious. You had no interest in your nephew until you learned of his inheritance. That does not suggest genuine concern for his welfare." Robert's face had gone red. "I have every right to ensure my nephew is properly raised. You have the right to file a petition. I have the right to deny it." The judge signed a document with a decisive flourish. "Petition denied. Thomas Ethan Hale will remain in the custody of his father and stepmother. Mr. Robert Hale is welcome to visit his nephew and maintain a familial relationship, but he will have no legal authority over the child or his inheritance." The words took a moment to penetrate. When they did, Ethan felt something release in his chest, some knot of tension he'd been carrying since Cordell first appeared at the cabin. They'd won. Thomas was theirs. Beside him, Clara made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pressed her face against Thomas's hair, her shoulders shaking with relief or joy or both. Robert stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. My brother is a recluse who lives like an animal in the mountains." "Your brother is a father raising his son," the judge interrupted, "as is his right. This hearing is concluded." Robert's lawyer gathered papers with angry efficiency. Robert himself looked at Ethan with an expression of pure fury, and for a moment Ethan saw the brother he remembered from childhood, the boy who'd hated losing at anything,
who'd made every game into a battle he had to win.
"This isn't over."
Robert said quietly.
"Yes, it is. The judge ruled. Thomas stays with us. I could appeal, file new petitions. I have resources you can't imagine. Do it. We'll fight every one." Ethan stood, moved to stand beside Clara. "Thomas is our son. You'll never get him." For a long moment, the brothers stared at each other across the courtroom. Then Robert shook his head, something like grudging respect crossing his face. "You really do love her," he said. "I thought it was an act for the judge." "But you meant it." Ethan looked at Clara, at the way she held Thomas like she'd fight armies to keep him safe. Every word. Robert left without another comment, his lawyer trailing behind. The courtroom emptied quickly, leaving just Ethan, Clara, Thomas, and Cordell, who'd been sitting quietly in the back. "Congratulations," the lawyer said. "That could have gone much worse." "Thank you for your help," Ethan said.
"What do we owe you?" "Consider it handled. I don't like seeing the law used to separate families." Cordell tipped his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Hale, you were very convincing. I think you surprised the judge." "I surprised myself," Clara admitted. They walked out of the courthouse into brilliant October sunshine. Denver sprawled around them, busy and loud and full of people going about their lives without any idea that 3 people on the courthouse steps had just won the right to stay together. "We should celebrate," Ethan said. "Buy Thomas something, maybe get a proper meal that neither of us cooked." But Clara wasn't listening. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You told the judge you loved me." "I did." "Did you mean it?" Ethan could have deflected, could have claimed it was strategy, something he'd said to strengthen their case. But he was done lying, even by omission. "Yes, I meant it." "Since when?" "I don't know. It didn't happen all at once."
"Just gradually, over months of watching you save my son and rebuild our home and refuse to give up even when everything was hard. You're the strongest person I know, Clara. How could I not love you?" She looked away, blinking rapidly. "You said you weren't asking me to be Sarah, that you didn't want anything except partnership." "I'm still not asking. I'm just telling you the truth. What you do with it is up to you." Thomas started fussing, wanting to nurse. Clara shifted him automatically, but she didn't move toward privacy. Just stood there on the courthouse steps, holding the baby, looking at Ethan like she was trying to solve an impossible equation. "I'm not ready to love you back," she said finally. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready. What Daniel and I had, it died with him, and I don't know if I can build something like that again." "I know, but I want to try. Not now, not tomorrow, but someday, when the grief isn't so heavy and the fear isn't so loud, I want to try to see if what we have could become something more." It was more than Ethan had expected, more than he'd let himself hope for. "That's enough. That's more than enough." They found a quiet spot in a park where Clara could nurse Thomas, and then they walked through Denver like a real family, husband, wife, baby, buying small, unnecessary things and eating food they didn't have to cook themselves. It should have felt strange playing at normalcy when their whole relationship was built on crisis and compromise, but instead it felt right, natural. That night at the boarding house after Thomas was asleep, Clara knocked on Ethan's door. "Come in," he called. She entered but didn't sit, just stood in the doorway looking uncertain. "I've been thinking about what you said, about loving me." "Clara, you don't have to—" "Let me finish. I've been thinking that maybe love isn't what I thought it was. Maybe it's not the grand passion I had with Daniel, all fire and intensity. Maybe sometimes love is quieter, steadier. Maybe it's watching someone build you a room with a door that locks because they respect your need for safety. Maybe it's fighting through blizzards and sickness and legal battles because giving up isn't an option." She took a step into the room. "Maybe I've been so busy protecting myself from loving you that I didn't notice I already do. Not the way I love Daniel, but in a different way. A better way, maybe." Ethan's heart was pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the separate rooms were a good idea when we started, when I needed space and safety and distance. But maybe I don't need so much distance anymore." "Clara?" "I'm not proposing we change everything overnight. I'm just saying maybe we could start. Close the distance a little bit. See what happens." She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd bought that afternoon. close enough that when she reached for his hand, their fingers tangled together naturally. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "of needing you, of losing you, of this whole thing falling apart and having to survive another loss." "I'm terrified too," Ethan said. "I lost Sarah, lost the future I'd planned, spent 3 years convinced I was better off alone. Then you showed up and ruined everything by making me want things again." Clara laughed, watery but genuine. "We're a mess, aren't we? The best kind of mess." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time. Not kissing, not making promises about the future, just sitting together in the lamplight while in the next room, their son slept peacefully, unaware that his parents were finally becoming what they'd pretended to be. "We should go back to the cabin soon," Clara said eventually. "Thomas doesn't travel well, and I miss having a kitchen that's actually mine. Tomorrow. We'll stay one more night in the city, then head home." Home. The word felt different now, not just a place but a state of being. The three of them together in the mountains, building something that was theirs alone. They returned to the cabin 3 days later, and everything was exactly as they'd left it. The chickens needed feeding, the garden had a few late vegetables ready to harvest. The mountains were turning gold with autumn, but somehow it all looked different, more permanent, more real. Clara put Thomas down for a nap and immediately started cleaning, as if the cabin had gotten dirty in their absence instead of just dusty. Ethan watched her work and realized this was her way of reclaiming the space, of making it fully hers now that the threat of losing it had passed. "I'm going to expand the garden next spring," she announced. "Put in more rows. Maybe try corn if we can keep the deer out." "Good idea. And we should get another goat. Thomas is starting to eat regular food, but he still needs milk, and it would be good to have backup." "I'll build another stall." She stopped sweeping and looked at him. "You keep agreeing to everything. Because they're good ideas. Or because you're afraid if you disagree, I'll remember I can leave and actually go." Ethan crossed the room, took the broom from her hands, set it aside. "I'm agreeing because you're making plans. Because you're thinking about next spring and the year after that. Because you're talking about our future like it's real." "It is real," Clara said. "Isn't it?" "It's as real as we make it." She kissed him then, the first time she'd initiated contact that was about more than comfort or convenience. It was brief, tentative, testing. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed. "I'm still not ready for everything," she said quickly. "I just wanted to try that, see if it felt right." "Did it?" "I'm not sure yet. Ask me again in a few months." But she was smiling when she said it, and Ethan felt hope settle into his chest like something he could finally trust. The winter came early that year as if to make up for the freak storm in July. Snow fell in November and didn't stop until April, but they were ready for it. Ethan had laid in extra supplies, had winterized the cabin and barn better than ever before. Clara had preserved everything the garden produced, had filled the root cellar with food that would see them through until spring. And Thomas thrived. By his first birthday, he was walking, saying a handful of words, laughing at everything. Clara weaned him slowly, replacing nursing with solid food and goat's milk, and the transition was so gradual that neither of them felt the loss. The day Thomas stopped nursing entirely, Clara cried, not from sadness exactly, but from the recognition that this thing that had bound them together, this biological necessity, was gone. What they had now was choice. They were choosing each other, choosing this life, choosing to stay. "We should have another baby," Ethan said one night that winter, the words surprising both of them. Clara looked up from her mending. "What?" "A baby. Brother or sister for Thomas, if you want." "You're serious?" "I'm serious. We have the room, the resources. And I think it would be good. For all of us." Clara set down her mending carefully. "I'm 30 years old. Daniel and I tried for 2 years before I finally conceived. The baby I lost was probably my only chance. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe you could try again. With me." She was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was very soft. "I don't know if I could survive losing another baby." "You wouldn't lose this one. We'd be careful. Stay close to Denver when you got far along. Find the best doctor. Do everything right." "You can't promise that. Babies die. Women die. That's just how life is." "You're right." I can't promise, but I can promise I'll be there, that you won't go through it alone like you did with your daughter." Clara turned to look at him, and her eyes were wet. "You really want this? Another child?" "I want a family with you, however that looks. If it's just the three of us, that's enough. But if you want more, if you're willing to try, then yes, I want that too." She came to him then, climbed into his lap like she'd learned to do on the cold nights when being close was about warmth and comfort as much as affection. "Ask me again in spring, when the grief isn't so fresh and the fear isn't so loud. I'll ask you every spring until you say yes." She laughed against his neck. "You're persistent. I'm in love with you. That makes a man persistent." "I love you too," she said, and it was the first time she'd said it without caveat or qualification. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. I love you and Thomas and this life we've built. I love it so much it terrifies me. Then we're even, because you terrify me in the best possible way." They sat like that until the fire burned low, holding each other in the cabin they'd built from necessity and choice and stubborn refusal to give up. Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted, the creek ran high, and Clara's garden exploded with new growth. Thomas turned too, running everywhere, talking in full sentences, asking endless questions about everything. And one morning in May, Clara woke Ethan with a kiss and a whisper. "Ask me again." "Ask you what?" "About another baby." "Ask me again." Ethan pulled her closer, felt her warmth against him, and smiled. "Do you want to have another baby?" "Yes," she said. "I want to try. I'm terrified and probably crazy, but I want to try. Then we'll try. And whatever happens, we'll face it together." Their daughter was born the following February, a healthy 8-pound baby with Clara's dark hair and Ethan's blue eyes. The birth was long and hard, and there were moments when Ethan thought he'd lose Clara the way he'd lost Sarah. But the Denver doctor knew his business, and Clara was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. And when it was over, they had a squalling, perfect daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth. "For both the mothers she'll never meet," Clara said, holding the baby while Thomas peered at his new sister with suspicious fascination. "You're Sarah and my Elizabeth." "They'd both be proud of you," Ethan said. "I hope so. I hope they're both somewhere watching over us, proud of this strange family we've made." Years passed. Thomas grew tall and strong, with his father's quiet competence and his mother's fierce determination. Sarah Elizabeth grew into a force of nature, fearless and laughing, and absolutely convinced the mountains existed for her personal enjoyment. 2 more children followed, a son they named Daniel and another daughter they called Margaret, after Clara's mother. The cabin expanded to accommodate them all. Ethan built rooms and Clara filled them with life, with laughter and arguments and ordinary chaos of raising children in the wilderness. They fought sometimes, about money and discipline and whether to stay in the mountains or move closer to town for the children's education. But they always came back to each other, to the partnership they'd built that first desperate summer. Robert never filed another petition, never visited either, which suited everyone fine. The children grew up knowing they had an uncle in St. Louis, but not particularly caring about it. Their family was here, in these mountains, in this cabin that had started as a prison for Clara and become the home she'd chosen. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Clara to the meadow where he'd buried his savings to pay her debts all those years ago. She was 39 now, with gray threads in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from squinting into the sun. She'd never been more beautiful. "I wanted to give you something," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Ethan, we agreed no presents. Money's tight with 4 children." "This isn't about money." The box held a ring, simple gold, nothing fancy. He'd had it made in Denver from a coin Sarah had given him before she died, the last piece of her he'd been holding on to. "I thought about keeping it," he admitted. "Thought Sarah would want me to save it for Thomas, but then I realized she'd want it to go to someone who actually belonged in this family, someone who chose us instead of being born into us." Clara's eyes filled. "I can't take Sarah's ring." "It's not Sarah's ring anymore, it's yours. Just like this family is yours, this life is yours. You chose it, you built it, it belongs to you." She let him slide the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. 10 years, she said wonderingly. 10 years since you bought me for $20 in Bitter Creek. Best $20 I ever spent." She laughed and cried at the same time, and he kissed her there in the meadow while the mountains watched and the wind carried their joy into the endless sky. From the cabin below came the sound of children playing, fighting, laughing. Thomas's voice calling for his mother. Sarah Elizabeth shrieking with delight about something. The ordinary, beautiful chaos of a family that had started with desperation and become something neither of them had dared to hope for. "We should get back," Clara said, "before they burn down the kitchen." Probably wise. But they stood there a moment longer, holding each other in the spring sunshine, remembering everything they'd survived to get here. The crying baby who wouldn't nurse, the freak blizzard, the courtroom battle, every moment of fear and grief and stubborn hope that had brought them to this meadow, this day, this life. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, "for buying me, for fighting for me, for loving me when I couldn't love you back. Thank you for saving my son, for staying when you could have left, for building this life with me. I'd do it all again. So would I." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, toward the noise and chaos and love that waited, toward the children who needed them, and the life they'd chosen, and the future they'd built from nothing but determination and desperate hope. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. It was better. And somewhere in the mountains, the wind carried their story of a man who'd learned to need someone again, a woman who'd learned to trust again, and a baby who'd refused to die. 3 broken souls who'd found each other in the wilderness and built something unshakable, a family, a home, a love that had started as transaction and become transformation. The best $20 anyone had ever spent.